Imagine waking up tomorrow and your entire city is empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just silence. Your neighbors, your family, everyone, gone. For these ancient civilizations, this nightmare was reality, and we still don't know why. Step back in time as we uncover the mystery of the lost Roman Ninth Legion, around 120 AD. In the year 120 AD, the Ninth Legion assembled at Iberacum with the precision of a machine that had never known failure. Dawn revealed rows of shields stacked like walls, their red paint dulled by years of rain and blood. Armor glinted beneath a pale northern sky, and the breath of 5,000 men rose together in a low, steady mist. This was not ceremony. This was preparation, practiced so often that fear no longer had space to grow. The Ninth was not young. It carried the weight of victories across Hispania, Germania, and Britannia, a lineage earned through conquest rather than legend. These men had marched through burning cities and frozen rivers. They had crushed rebellions that Rome later pretended were never dangerous. The empire trusted them because they had never failed it. Trust in Rome was granted only after brutality proved effective. Orders arrived without flourish, a northern advance beyond the familiar limits of Roman control, beyond the new frontier works, beyond lands where maps became vague and roads turned into suggestion rather than certainty. The tablets were sealed, signed, and unquestioned. For the Ninth Legion, obedience was instinct, not virtue. There was no sense of doom among the ranks. Soldiers joked as they packed. Veterans corrected younger men on how to wrap their feet against wet ground. Centurions walked the lines, noting small errors, correcting posture, checking straps. Everything about the departure felt routine, and that normality was the most dangerous detail of all. Iberacum itself seemed indifferent to their leaving. The city had watched legions come and go for generations. Traders counted coin. Children ran between stalls. A smith hammered iron into shape, as if 5,000 men were not preparing to vanish beyond the edge of the known world. Rome had made permanence feel ordinary. The Ninth marched out in disciplined silence, standards lifted, armor steady, boots striking earth in perfect rhythm. Roads built by Roman hands carried them north, straight and reliable, cutting through green land that still remembered resistance. Farms thinned. Watchtowers grew fewer. The land ahead belonged less to Rome with every mile. As days passed, the road began to fray. Stone gave way to packed earth. Earth softened into mud. Scouts returned with reports that grew shorter and less certain. Hills rose sharper. Forests pressed closer. The sky dimmed beneath cloud cover that rarely broke. This was not enemy territory in the way Rome understood enemies. It was absence, space without order. The legion adapted as it always had. Camps were raised each night with ritual precision. Trenches dug, palisades set, watches assigned, fires controlled. Roman order imposed itself on wild ground, and for a time, it worked. Discipline held the dark at bay. Yet the land resisted in quieter ways. Sound behaved strangely here. Voices carried too far, then vanished abruptly. Horn calls echoed back, altered, as if answered by unseen mouths. At night, fog rolled in, thick enough to swallow torches whole. Men woke, convinced someone had been standing over them, only to find nothing but wet earth and breath in the air. No enemy banners appeared. No war cries split the tree line. That absence gnawed at experienced soldiers more than any ambush. Rome understood violence. It did not understand waiting. Messages were prepared for the southern forts. Supply tallies, progress reports, requests for adjustments as terrain worsened. Couriers were dispatched along the same roads the legion had traveled days before. Their departure was noted. Their return was expected. No one recorded concern when they did not immediately reappear. The march continued northward into land that resisted measurement. Maps grew useless. Streams shifted overnight. Landmarks described by scouts seemed to move or vanish by the time the column arrived. The forest canopy thickened until daylight filtered down in thin, uncertain strands. Time itself felt altered, measured not by sun, but by fatigue. Still, morale held. The Ninth had endured worse. Germania had frozen men where they stood. Hispania had bled them in endless hills. Britannia itself had once been unknown. This was simply another edge to be pushed back. On the 12th day beyond the last confirmed Roman road, the legion crossed into terrain no surveyor had ever recorded. The ground rose into uneven highlands, broken by stone outcroppings and narrow valleys that funneled wind into constant whispers. Visibility dropped to a few dozen paces in places. Formations tightened. Shields shifted closer together. The standards remained upright, but the air around them felt heavy, as if even symbols carried weight here. That night, the camp was built beside a shallow river, whose name was not written anywhere. Fires burned low. Smoke clung close to the ground instead of rising. Men spoke less. Even laughter sounded cautious, quickly swallowed by fog. A sentry reported movement beyond the perimeter shortly before midnight. The shape was vague, distant, possibly animal. The report was logged and dismissed with practiced calm. The Ninth did not panic at shadows. By morning, nothing was found. No tracks, no disturbed ground, just damp grass and the slow-moving river. The march resumed. Somewhere during the following days, the sense of direction weakened. Compasses behaved erratically. Scouts returned arguing quietly among themselves. Each convinced the others had mistaken landmarks they could no longer find. Orders remained clear, but the land no longer obeyed them. And still, no enemy revealed itself. The last confirmed Roman record of the Ninth Legion was made during this advance. A brief logistical notation, mundane and unremarkable. Supplies accounted for, formation intact, progress slower than anticipated due to terrain, no mention of danger, no hint of alarm. The kind of record written thousands of times before by men who expected to write thousands more. After that entry, the silence began. Not sudden, not dramatic, just absence. No battle report followed. No casualty lists. No triumphs or pleas for reinforcements. The carefully maintained thread of Roman bureaucracy simply ended, as if cut cleanly rather than torn apart. The Ninth Legion did not stagger back south in fragments. It did not send wounded survivors or desperate messengers. It did not leave behind camps discovered later by other forces. It did not even leave rumors strong enough to become stories. 5,000 men crossed into the highlands, and the world behaved as if they never came back out. At the time, no one in Iberacum understood what had begun. Administrators assumed delay, weather, miscommunication. Rome's machine was patient when dealing with its own strength. It trusted itself too much to imagine total loss. But far to the north, in land Rome had never learned to name, the Ninth Legion marched beyond the final edge of certainty, and history closed behind them without sound. At first, the absence went unnoticed. In the weeks following the 9th Legion's final report, officials at Ibaracum assumed delay. Northern weather had always interfered with movement. Roads vanished under rain. Couriers were late more often than they were punctual. A powerful legion moving through difficult terrain required patience, not alarm. Rome trusted process, and process encouraged waiting. Supply officers continued their work. Grain allotments were adjusted. Replacement armor was requisitioned for units that still existed on parchment. Somewhere in the administrative machinery, the 9th Legion remained intact, marching steadily forward according to expectation rather than reality. When the first courier failed to return, no record of concern was made. Messages went missing constantly. A horse could break a leg. A river could swell overnight. No empire ruled without accepting small losses. It was the second missing courier that unsettled a junior clerk enough to note the irregularity. The notation was brief, almost apologetic, as if the writer feared wasting ink. A third courier was dispatched with duplicate tablets, his route clearly marked, his departure time recorded. He, too, did not return. By then, weeks had passed since the last word from the 9th. Still, no panic followed. Rome did not imagine disaster without evidence. It imagined delay. Winter crept closer. Traders returning from the north reported nothing unusual. No great battle scars, no villages celebrating victory, no captured armor on display. The land behaved as if 5,000 Roman soldiers had never passed through it. That silence should have been impossible. Rome's wars left marks. Broken weapons, charred timbers, graves, even hurried ones. Songs sung by enemies eager to boast. Even defeat produced noise. The absence of all of it began to trouble men who had spent their lives cataloging violence. A senior officer at Ibaracum ordered patrols sent north along the Legion's route. These were not rescue missions. They were confirmations. The assumption remained that the 9th had simply advanced farther than planned. The patrols found the last confirmed camp without difficulty. Trenches were neat, fire pits cold and clean. No debris suggested panic or haste. It looked exactly as it should have looked, and that precision made it disturbing. Beyond that point, certainty dissolved. Scouts pushed farther north than they were comfortable doing. They found no abandoned camps, no equipment, no remains of supply wagons, not even broken straps or dropped tools. The land did not look scoured by battle or trampled by retreat. It looked untouched. Reports returned with careful phrasing. Nothing observed. No signs of engagement. No evidence of conflict. The language was cautious, defensive, as if the writers feared the implications of their own words. Questions followed. If the 9th had been ambushed, where were the bodies? A battle large enough to destroy a full legion would leave scars visible for generations. Bone fragments would surface. Metal would remain. Blood would stain soil. None of it was there. If the legion had been defeated and captured, where were the prisoners? No tribes suddenly swelled with Roman slaves. No ransoms were demanded. No rumors spread of captives forced to fight or labor. If the 9th had deserted, the most absurd theory of all, where had 5,000 armed men gone? A mass desertion would tear Britannia apart. Banditry would surge. Settlements would fall. Instead, the province remained stable, almost calm. Each explanation collapsed under inspection, leaving only the shape of the mystery behind. As months passed, concern reached higher levels of command. Inquiries were sent south to Londinium, then across the sea to Gaul. Requests were made for any mention of the Ninth Legion in shipping records, payroll adjustments, or auxiliary correspondence. The answers returned negative. The Legion had stopped appearing not only in reports from the north, but everywhere. Pay records showed no final disbursement. Casualty rolls contained no names. Decorations were neither awarded nor revoked. It was as if the Legion had stepped out of the Empire's awareness entirely. That was when unease turned into something sharper. Rome documented failure obsessively. Losses were measured, categorized, and preserved in writing, even when the truth humiliated the empire. Defeat could be spun into sacrifice. Disaster could be reframed as martyrdom. What could not be tolerated was uncertainty. A search expedition was authorized the following spring. Not a legion, but a mixed force of scouts, engineers, and auxiliary troops familiar with the terrain. Their orders were explicit. Trace the route, identify evidence, recover anything that could explain what happened. They marched north with caution that bordered on superstition. They found nothing. No battlefield, no graves, no discarded standards, not even rumors, strong enough to repeat. Villages along the edge of the highlands spoke of no great clash. Elders claimed no knowledge. Hunters had not stumbled upon bones or armor. The land offered silence as its only answer. The expedition returned with reports that were difficult to read aloud. The words felt inadequate, almost offensive. An empire demanded facts, and there were none. Behind closed doors, conversations changed tone. If the Ninth Legion had been annihilated, Rome should have known how. If it had been disgraced, Rome should have punished someone. Instead, the empire was left with a void that could not be filled by ceremony or blame. Some officers suggested suppressing discussion until clarity emerged. Others argued that silence itself was dangerous, that rumors would grow without official narrative. A few dared to suggest that the truth, whatever it was, might already be worse than any rumor. Over time, a quieter response took shape. References to the Ninth Legion became less frequent in new documents. Unit lists were revised without explanation. Mentions in correspondence were corrected, then omitted. No proclamation announced its dissolution. No memorial honored its sacrifice. The Legion simply faded from administrative life. This absence was subtle, not abrupt. Rome did not erase loudly. It allowed memory to thin, then disappear. By the time a new generation of officers rose through the ranks, the Ninth Legion was already spoken of as something distant, uncertain. A unit that had once existed, perhaps, but no longer mattered. Questions about its fate were met with shrugs or deflection. That reaction revealed more than any idle report could have. An empire that prided itself on order had encountered something it could not explain or control. Instead of confronting it, Rome chose distance. Silence became policy, not accident. In taverns near the frontier, soldiers whispered theories after dark. Some claimed the Legion had marched too far and found land that resisted conquest in ways steel could not overcome. Others spoke of betrayal, of orders misunderstood or obeyed too well. A few suggested that the Legion discovered something that made returning impossible. None of those stories appeared in official records. By the time years had passed, the absence hardened into accepted fact. The Ninth Legion was gone, and no one in power seemed eager to say why. Rome continued expanding, fortifying, and recording. but a blank space remained where certainty should have lived. The silence did not scream. It waited, and in that waiting, something more unsettling than defeat took shape. The realization that an empire built on documentation had chosen not to document something at all. 5,000 men had vanished, and Rome had learned to live with the mystery by pretending it no longer existed. Rome did not announce its fear. It absorbed it. There was no decree declaring the 9th Legion lost, no public mourning, no explanation carved into stone. The empire chose a quieter solution, one perfected over centuries. It allowed memory to thin until it could be dismissed as confusion rather than loss. Official lists of legions were revised. Scribal hands, careful and precise, copied older records into new ones, and in the process, a name failed to transfer. Not crossed out, not condemned, simply omitted. The 9th Legion did not fall. It faded. This method was familiar to Rome. When emperors disgraced themselves, their faces were chipped from statues, their names scraped from inscriptions. The practice had a name, though few spoke it aloud. Condemnation of memory. History reshaped not through lies, but through absence. What made this erasure different was scale. Rome had condemned individuals before. It had never condemned 5,000 soldiers without explanation. The very thought contradicted the empire's image of itself as rational, ordered, and absolute. Yet the omission continued, quiet and thorough. Veterans who once served alongside the 9th noticed the change first. Old campaign stories were met with polite discomfort. Younger officers listened with narrowed eyes, uncertain whether the legion being described had truly existed. Some assumed exaggeration. Others suspected treason in the telling. Even questions became suspect. A tribune who inquired too persistently about missing unit honors found his advancement delayed without reason. A clerk who attempted to reconcile conflicting roles was reassigned to a distant post. No punishment was recorded. None was needed. The message traveled faster without ink. Silence was safer. The longer Rome refused to speak of the 9th, the more dangerous the truth seemed by implication. If the fate of the legion were simple, it would have been recorded. If it were honorable, it would have been celebrated. That it was neither suggested something far worse than defeat. Rumors continued at the margins of the empire, where control weakened and whispers found room to breathe. Some said the 9th had crossed into land Rome was never meant to tame. Others believed the legion encountered knowledge that unraveled loyalty, something that could not be brought back without consequence. A few claimed the men were still alive somewhere beyond the frontier, bound by oaths not to return. None of these stories mattered individually. What mattered was that Rome refused to replace them with an official truth. Archaeology, centuries later, would search for answers and find only fragments that raised more questions. Eagle standards recovered far from expected paths, inscriptions that referenced officers whose legions no longer existed, forts reinforced as if guarding against something that never arrived. The land itself offered no confession. No battlefield emerged to claim the 9th. No mass grave surrendered bones to careful hands. The soil remained stubbornly quiet, as though whatever happened had been designed to leave nothing behind. That absence became the final clue. Empires fear many things: rebellion, invasion, decay. But above all, they fear loss of narrative. Control depends on explanation. Authority depends on certainty. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion represented a failure not only of military power, but of meaning. Rome could conquer enemies. It could not conquer a void. And so, the empire chose the only victory left to it. It erased the question. Over generations, the Ninth Legion slipped fully into uncertainty. Scholars argued over its fate using scraps of evidence and silence as foundation. Some insisted the Legion had been destroyed earlier than believed. Others claimed it had never marched north at all. Debate replaced memory, and debate diluted threat. That dilution was intentional. The truth, whatever it had been, lost its power as fewer people remembered. There was a truth to uncover. Yet something endured beneath the erasure. A pattern. Rome expanded, but never far beyond the highlands where the Ninth vanished. Frontiers hardened instead of advancing. Walls replaced roads. Forts turned inward as much as outward. The empire had learned a lesson it never recorded. There were limits. The Ninth Legion did not simply disappear from history. It forced history to change course. The expansion slowed. The ambition narrowed. Rome survived, but with a caution it had not possessed before. 5,000 men paid the price for that knowledge, and their reward was silence. Perhaps Rome believed forgetting them was mercy. Perhaps it believed memory would invite repetition. Or perhaps the empire understood that some truths, once spoken, could not be controlled. The Ninth Legion marched beyond the world. Rome thought it understood. Whatever they found there was powerful enough to stop them, and frightening enough to make an empire look away. In the end, the greatest mystery is not what happened to the Legion. It is why Rome, master of record and stone, decided that forgetting was safer than knowing. And somewhere beyond the reach of history, in land that never learned Rome's name, 5,000 footsteps faded without echo, leaving behind the most dangerous thing an empire can face: an unanswered question. Let's uncover the vanished secrets of the Roanoke colony, around 1590. They arrived at Roanoke Island believing the ocean had delivered them into history. The land was green, thick with trees and possibility, and the air carried a sweetness that felt like permission to begin again. 117 souls stepped ashore, men with calloused hands, women with guarded hope, children who did not yet understand how fragile promises could be. They were not explorers chasing glory. They were families sent to endure, instructed to turn wilderness into permanence. From the first weeks, the colony revealed its quiet hostility. The soil resisted their tools. Crops struggled under unfamiliar seasons. Fresh water sources were limited, forcing daily walks that left settlers exposed and anxious. Even in daylight, the forest pressed inward, its silence broken only by the snap of branches and the distant cry of birds that did not scatter when watched. The land did not welcome them, but it also did not reject them outright. It waited. Governor John White understood the danger better than most. Supplies dwindled faster than projected. The settlers had been promised regular resupply, but the Atlantic was not a road. It was a gamble. Storms delayed ships. Politics delayed decisions. Every meal became a calculation. Every tool a precious object to be guarded rather than used freely. Children were taught to eat slowly. Conversations shifted from optimism to logistics. Then, from logistics to worry. Relations with nearby tribes hovered in a tense balance. Trade occurred, cautious and brief, always accompanied by the unspoken knowledge that misunderstanding could turn fatal. White saw the fear in his people, but he also saw their restraint. They did not fortify aggressively. They did not expand recklessly. They waited for relief that did not come. As weeks turned into months, the truth hardened. The colony could not survive another season without supplies. White was faced with a decision that history would later simplify, but which at the time felt unbearable. Leave them and risk never returning, or stay and watch them starve together. The choice was framed as temporary, but no one truly believed that. When White announced his departure, the settlement did not erupt in protest. Silence answered him, heavy and resigned. The morning he left, the shore was crowded. Mothers held children tightly, as if memorizing their weight. Men avoided each other's eyes. No speeches were made. Promises were exchanged quietly, repeated until they sounded like prayers. White instructed them carefully. If forced to abandon the settlement, carve a cross. If leaving by choice, leave a sign. He did not explain why the distinction mattered so much. He only insisted. The ships vanished beyond the horizon, and the colony stood alone. At first, life continued with stubborn normalcy. Gardens were tended, repairs were made, children played between cabins, their laughter echoing too loudly in the clearing. Yet something subtle shifted. Meals grew quieter. Night watches were extended. The forest seemed closer after sunset, shadows thickening between the trees. Every unfamiliar sound carried weight. Every delay felt intentional. Food was rationed with precision. Hunting parties ventured farther, returning with less. Tools wore down and could not be replaced. Clothing frayed. Small injuries lingered longer than they should have. The settlers began to measure time not by days, but by remaining resources. Still, there was no panic. Whatever fear existed was controlled, folded inward, shared only in glances and whispered conversations after dark. Children sensed it first. They asked fewer questions. They stayed closer to their parents. Toys were cherished, then carefully stored away rather than played with. One small doll, crudely sewn and already worn thin, passed from hand to hand among the youngest, as if it were something sacred. As winter approached, discussions became urgent. Remaining on Roanoke Island without support meant gambling with extinction. Leaving meant venturing into unknown territory with families in tow. No choice was safe. No choice felt right. The colony debated quietly, without shouting or division. Whatever decision they would make, it would be made together. That unity was their greatest strength, and possibly their greatest risk. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the settlement in amber light, a meeting was called. The details of that discussion were never recorded, but its outcome was absolute. Plans were formed carefully. Supplies were sorted, not in haste, but with intention. Homes were not destroyed. They were dismantled piece by piece. Wood was stacked. Tools were set aside. What could be carried was prepared. What could not was left where it lay. There was no farewell ceremony, no final prayers spoken aloud. The colony moved as one, each family trusting that the others understood the gravity of what they were doing. Whatever awaited them beyond the trees, it was preferable to waiting for a ship that might never return. By morning, the settlement was empty. Plates still rested on tables. Doors hung open. Footprints led away from the clearing, then vanished into the undergrowth. The forest closed behind them without resistance, swallowing sound, erasing direction. When John White finally returned years later, he would search for chaos and find order instead. He would expect death and encounter silence. The promise of a new world had not been broken by violence, but by absence. And absence, he would learn too late, leaves no answers behind. The shoreline looked wrong the moment John White stepped onto it. Roanoke Island greeted him with stillness so complete it felt rehearsed. No smoke rose from hearths. No voices carried across the clearing. Even the birds seemed cautious, as if the land itself were holding its breath. White stood frozen, his boots sinking slightly into familiar sand, his eyes searching for movement that never came. After years of delay, storms, and political obstruction, he had returned at last. He had prepared himself for graves, for ruins, for the smell of death. What he found instead was far worse. The settlement stood intact. Cabins lined the clearing as they had before, their structures sound, their timbers weathered, but unbroken. There were no signs of fire or assault, no scorched walls, no shattered doors. The silence was not the silence of destruction. It was the silence of absence. White moved forward slowly, each step heavy with a dread he could not yet name. Inside the first cabin, he stopped breathing. A table stood at the center of the room. Plates rested upon it, arranged as if a meal had been interrupted and never resumed. Wooden bowls were empty but clean. Utensils lay where hands had last set them down. Nothing was overturned, nothing hurried. The scene suggested not flight, but departure, careful and deliberate. White moved from house to house, his unease growing with each threshold crossed. Belongings remained everywhere, clothing folded neatly, tools stacked against walls, books left open, pages curled by humidity. These were not the remnants of panic. People running for their lives do not leave behind what they value most. They do not pause to organize. Outside, the ground told its own story. There were no drag marks, no signs of struggle, no disturbed earth that might suggest graves hastily dug or bodies concealed. White knelt, pressing his palm into the soil, as if the land itself might confess. It did not. Then he saw it. A small figure lay partially buried near the edge of the clearing, half claimed by dirt and weeds. A child's doll, crudely stitched, its fabric faded by time and rain. One button eye was missing. The other stared upward, unblinking. White picked it up carefully, as if afraid it might crumble in his hands. Children did not abandon such things easily. They carried them even into hunger, into fear, into sleep. This was not an item discarded lightly. His heart sank with a clarity that left no room for denial. He searched for signs of violence again, hoping to prove himself wrong, hoping for blood, for anything that could explain what his eyes refused to accept. There was none. The settlement had not been attacked. It had been emptied. At the far edge of the clearing, White found the post. The word was carved deeply into the wood, its letters deliberate and clean. Croatoan. He stared at it for a long time. The name meant something to him. It referred to a nearby island and a people known to the colonists. Before leaving years earlier, White had given instructions. If the colony were forced to abandon the settlement under threat, they were to carve a cross. If they left by choice, they were to leave a sign. There was no cross, only the word. The implication unsettled him more than any imagined massacre could have. This was not a warning. It was not a plea. It was information. A message meant to be understood. White ordered the surrounding area, searched. His men moved through the forest cautiously, scanning for tracks, listening for movement. They found nothing. Whatever path the colonists had taken, It had been swallowed by time and growth. The land had erased their passage with unsettling efficiency. As daylight faded, fear began to creep into the crew. Some whispered that the settlers had been taken. Others claimed they had fled inland or fallen victim to famine. None of the theories held. Famine leaves bodies, raids leave destruction, even migration leaves traces. This disappearance left none. That night, White could not sleep. He sat alone near the extinguished hearths, replaying memories he had once trusted. Faces blurred together, promises echoed without sound. He wondered how long the settlement had stood empty, waiting for him to return. Days, months, years. The thought that he might have arrived too late to save them, or too early to understand what had happened, pressed down on him with equal weight. In the days that followed, White sought answers from nearby tribes. He asked about sightings, about strangers, about families moving through the region. The responses were calm and consistent. They had not seen the colonists. They had not taken them in. They knew nothing of their fate. White listened carefully, searching for cracks in the stories, for hesitation or contradiction. He found none. The silence persisted. No bodies were ever found, no graves uncovered, no weapons recovered. The forest offered nothing. The sea offered nothing. It was as if 117 people had stepped out of the world at once. White stood before the carved post one final time before leaving Roanoke Island. The word remained sharp despite the passing years, as if it refused to fade. He understood then that the settlement had not been erased by violence, but by choice or necessity, so complete it left no aftermath. History would demand explanations, records would be searched, theories would multiply, yet none would resolve the central truth. The colony did not fall. It vanished. John White left Roanoke Island carrying nothing that could be shown, only questions that could not be set down. The sea received his ship without resistance, as if it had been waiting to seal the island behind him. With every mile that passed, the silence he had encountered seemed to follow, clinging to his thoughts more tightly than the salt air on his skin. Back in England, explanations were demanded. Investors wanted reassurance. Officials wanted closure. White could offer neither. He spoke of empty homes, of untouched belongings, of a word carved into wood with careful intent. Each retelling sounded less convincing than the last. How could an entire community vanish without violence, without witnesses, without leaving behind even the courtesy of a conclusion? Records were consulted. Maps were revised. Letters were written to men who had never seen Roanoke and never would. Over time, the urgency faded, or redirected attention. New ventures demanded funding. The fate of one distant colony became an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Silence proved easier to accept than uncertainty. Yet the questions refused to die. Some claimed the settlers had joined nearby tribes, abandoning English identity in exchange for survival. It was a comforting theory, but one unsupported by proof. No confirmed accounts described a sudden influx of strangers. No tools bearing English markings surfaced. No children speaking unfamiliar words were noted by those who would have noticed such things. Others argued they had moved inland, swallowed by the wilderness, undone by hunger or exposure. That explanation collapsed under scrutiny. Even failed migrations leave remnants. Bones, camps, something. Roanoke left nothing behind except absence. The Croatoan people remained central to speculation, though never by their own choosing. They maintained that they had not seen the colonists, had not sheltered them, had not harmed them. Their accounts did not change over time. That consistency unsettled those who expected deception. History often assumes guilt when answers are too steady. White himself was trapped between doubt and responsibility. He revisited the memory of the carved word repeatedly, examining it from every angle. Croatoan was not a cry for help. It was not hurried. It was placed where it could be found, as if the colonists believed discovery would come, as if they trusted that someone would return and understand. But understanding never arrived. As years passed, the physical traces of the settlement decayed. Wood rotted. Paths vanished. The forest reclaimed the clearing with quiet efficiency. Nature showed no interest in preserving evidence for human curiosity. By the time new explorers arrived, Roanoke Island bore no sign of the lives once sustained there. The land had closed the story on its own terms. What endured instead was the idea of erasure. The Roanoke colony became a lesson disguised as a mystery. It demonstrated that history does not record everything, only what survives long enough to be written down. Communities can dissolve without spectacle. People can disappear without a villain. The absence of violence does not mean the absence of tragedy. The most unsettling possibility lingered beneath every theory. The colonists may have survived. They may have adapted. They may have chosen a life beyond record, beyond empire, beyond the fragile promises that had brought them across the ocean. If that were true, then Roanoke was not a failure of endurance, but a rejection of history itself. Such a conclusion was unacceptable to those who believed progress required documentation. A story without an ending threatened the illusion of control. So the mystery was preserved, retold not to be solved, but to be contained. White never returned to Roanoke Island. He died with the question unanswered, his role reduced to a footnote attached to a vanishing act. His guilt, if he carried it, found no resolution. The colony he left behind did not leave him forgiveness or blame, only silence. Centuries later, the site would be excavated, studied, measured. Scholars would argue over fragments and soil discoloration. Theories would multiply, each claiming clarity. None would offer certainty. The truth remained just out of reach, not hidden, but gone. That is what makes Roanoke endure. Not the possibility of massacre, not the romance of survival, but the simple, terrifying fact that 117 people stepped out of history together, leaving behind a world that refused to notice for very long. The final legacy of the Roanoke colony is not a cautionary tale about ambition or failure. It is a reminder that history is selective, and survival does not always leave a mark. Sometimes the most complete disappearance is the one that happens quietly, with intention, and without witnesses. And sometimes the most honest ending is no ending at all. Join us as we explore the ancient marvels of the Anasazi cliff dwellers around 1300 AD. For 7 centuries, the people now called the Anasazi-shaped stone as if it were clay. They carved homes into sheer canyon walls where the earth dropped away beneath their feet and the sky pressed close above their heads. From the canyon floor, their cities looked impossible, honeycombs of shadowed rooms tucked into vertical rock faces that offered no easy path for enemies, no simple retreat for the careless. These were not settlements chosen by accident or beauty. They were solutions to a problem that had endured for generations. Every handhold had been tested by time. Every ladder rung bore the smooth polish of thousands of bare feet. Children learned balance before they learned fear, climbing narrow ledges with a confidence earned through repetition. Food was hauled upward, grain by grain, stored behind sealed stone doors in rooms that never saw sunlight. Water was rationed with care, guided by an understanding of drought cycles learned across lifetimes. Nothing about these cliff dwellings spoke of improvisation. They were deliberate, defensive, and deeply patient. From above, the cities disappeared into the stone. From below, they watched everything. That vigilance defined daily life. Fires were kept small and smokeless. Voices carried only within stone walls. Movement beyond the cliffs followed strict patterns, as if the land itself were listening. For reasons never written down, these people believed height meant survival. Whatever danger haunted the valleys did not reach easily into the cliffs. That belief was reinforced year after year as children grew into elders beneath the same carved ceilings their ancestors had shaped. At their height, the cities thrived. Storage rooms were full. Corn cobs lay stacked in neat bundles, sealed against insects and rot. Pottery sat half-finished beside stone tools worn thin by use. Sandals made from yucca fibers rested near sleeping spaces, shaped to the exact curves of their owners' feet. These were not the remnants of a people preparing to leave. They were signs of a people expecting tomorrow to look like today. Then, tomorrow never came. The abandonment was not slow. Archaeology shows no long decline, no gradual thinning of life. Instead, it arrived with the silence of a held breath. Rooms were left exactly as they had been used the day before. Cooking vessels remained by cold hearths. Food sat untouched in storage chambers. Tools lay where hands had released them, as if interrupted by something that did not allow completion or closure. No scorch marks stained the stone. No barricades were hastily built. There were no mass graves, no piles of broken weapons, no evidence of a last stand. The cities did not fall. They were emptied. This absence of violence unsettles historians more than any sign of war. When societies collapse under attack, they leave chaos behind. When famine drives people away, they take what they can carry. Here, neither explanation fits. The Anasazi climbed down from the strongest, defenses they had ever built, and walked into an exposed world without returning. The question is not why they left. The question is why they left everything. The cliffs had solved every visible threat. They protected against raids. They controlled access. They offered sightlines that stretched for miles. Any enemy approaching could be seen long before it reached the walls. For centuries, that advantage worked. Generations invested their lives in these fortresses because the logic was sound. So what kind of danger renders height useless? The stone walls themselves whisper unease. Many rooms were designed without clear sight lines between them, forcing residents to move through narrow passages where sound traveled farther than light. Ladders could be pulled up, isolating sections of the settlement from each other as easily as from the outside world. Privacy was scarce, yet separation was always possible. In peaceful times, this design offered safety. In fearful times, it offered concealment. Defensive architecture has consequences. It trains a community to think in terms of threats. It encourages suspicion, vigilance, and control. Over centuries, these instincts harden into culture. When danger becomes constant, trust becomes fragile. The Anasazi left no written language to explain their choices. Their knowledge passed through stories spoken aloud, shaped by memory and intention. Yet when descendants of these people speak of the cliff dwellers, their voices change. Certain stories are shortened. Certain explanations stop abruptly. Some topics are avoided entirely. Silence in oral tradition is rarely accidental. Archaeologists once assumed the cliffs protected against outsiders. Raiding groups, hostile neighbors, unpredictable violence from beyond the horizon. That explanation fits the structure, but fails the ending. Outsiders cannot erase an entire population without leaving evidence. They cannot compel people to abandon food and tools while leaving no trace of pursuit. If the threat came from outside, the cliffs would have been the answer. If the threat came from within, the cliffs would have been a trap. The higher the city, the fewer the exits. The narrower the paths, the easier it becomes to control movement. A place built to keep enemies out can just as easily keep victims in. Stone remembers everything, but explains nothing. The walls stand mute, holding secrets without judgment. What remains undeniable is this: a society that invests 700 years into vertical survival does not abandon it lightly. A single generation does not undo centuries of careful adaptation unless something has fundamentally changed. The danger they faced did not erode their walls. It did not burn their homes. It did not starve them into flight. It convinced them that staying was worse. As the sun set behind the canyon rim on the last day these cities were inhabited, shadows filled the rooms the way they always had. Fires were not lit. Doors were not sealed. People descended ladders carved by ancestors they would never see again. They stepped away from safety with the calm of those who believe the danger will follow if they hesitate. The cliffs remained, waiting. They still wait now, empty and intact, guarding nothing. Because whatever drove the Anasazi from the stone did not need to break down walls. It had already passed through them. The first clues were not found in the open plazas or along the cliff edges, where danger was expected to appear. They were found inside the rooms, in places meant for rest, storage, and ritual. When archaeologists began to examine what the Anasazi left behind, they noticed something deeply wrong about the pattern of remains. Bones were not buried with care. They were scattered, mixed, broken in ways that did not match accidents or animal activity. At first, the damage was subtle. Hairline fractures along skulls. Long bones split lengthwise with deliberate precision. Cut marks appeared where muscle once attached to bone, clean and unmistakable, made by stone tools identical to those used in hunting and food preparation. These were not the marks of battle. They were the marks of processing. Cannibalism is a word that shuts down thinking. It invites shock instead of analysis. Yet in archaeology, it carries a specific meaning, one tied to survival, ritual, or terror. Among the Anasazi, the evidence points to something more disturbing than hunger alone. Some bones show signs of cooking. Others show trauma that occurred before death, crushing blows to the skull, delivered with force and intention. These people were not dying quietly. In several dwellings, bodies were found where they fell, not arranged, not honored. Some were children. Some were elders. The injuries were inconsistent, suggesting chaos rather than ceremony. Yet the cut marks were methodical. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. That knowledge did not come from desperation. It came from familiarity. The question shifts here, away from outside threats and toward the social fabric of the cities themselves. Famine alone does not produce this pattern. Starvation forces people to leave, to migrate, to seek relief elsewhere. It does not explain crushed skulls inside fortified homes. It does not explain why neighbors turned tools into instruments of violence. Something had already fractured long before the final descent from the cliffs. Drought likely played its part. Tree ring data confirms long periods of environmental stress. Crops would have failed. Water sources would have dwindled. Pressure would have mounted year after year. But hardship does not automatically destroy a society. Communities endure scarcity when trust remains intact. They collapse when fear replaces it. Inside the cliff dwellings, fear had nowhere to escape. The architecture that once ensured safety now amplified suspicion. Narrow corridors forced encounters. Ladders controlled access between families. Rooms could be sealed from the inside, isolating those within. In times of peace, these features offered protection. In times of distrust, they offered opportunity. Control became possible. It is here that the evidence grows darker. Some remains show signs of restraint before death. Wrists positioned unnaturally. Bodies found in rooms with no signs of struggle beyond the fatal injuries themselves. This suggests authority, not panic. Someone was giving orders. Someone was deciding who lived and who did not. Cannibalism in this context becomes a tool rather than a consequence. A way to dominate, a way to terrorize, a way to erase the humanity of the victim while reinforcing power over the living. When violence becomes ritualized, it spreads faster than hunger ever could. Oral traditions among descendant communities do not deny hardship. They speak of drought, migration, and adaptation. But they fall silent when pressed on internal violence. Stories end abruptly. Names are avoided. Lessons are implied, but never explained. In cultures where memory is carried through speech, refusal to speak is the strongest form of preservation. The cliffs did not hide monsters. They created conditions where ordinary people could become them. Children raised in constant vigilance learn fear as a survival skill. Elders under pressure cling to control. When resources shrink and trust erodes, leaders emerge who promise order at any cost. Inside stone walls where escape is limited, those costs are paid in blood. This is not speculation built on imagination alone. The physical evidence supports it. Trauma before death, dismemberment after, consumption that followed patterns rather than randomness. The absence of defensive wounds in some victims suggests compliance or helplessness. These were not battles. They were executions. Once violence becomes internal, fortifications lose their meaning. Walls do not protect you from the person who shares your food, your shelter, your lineage. Height offers no advantage when the threat sleeps a few rooms away. The people of the cliffs would have understood this before anyone else. They would have felt the shift in daily life, the way glances lingered too long, the way silence thickened. They would have known when rules changed, when doors closed more often, when certain families stopped being seen. Fear spreads quietly. It teaches people to listen at night, to memorize exits, to prepare children without explaining why. It turns homes into places of calculation rather than rest. By the time the final decision came, the choice was no longer between safety and danger. It was between a known horror and an unknown risk. Leaving meant exposure. Staying meant certainty. The cannibalized bones left behind were not the cause of the abandonment. They were the warning signs that came too late for some and just in time for others. Whatever authority had taken root within the cliffs could not be dismantled without bloodshed. The only way to survive was to remove oneself entirely. to abandon the walls, to abandon the memory, to walk away from stone that had witnessed too much. And so the ladders were lowered one last time, not in panic, but in quiet agreement. The cities emptied because the danger had already won. Embark on a voyage to discover the forgotten world of the Greenland Norse colony around the 1400s. Greenland did not feel like the edge of the world to those who lived there. It felt like home. Along the long fjords where seawater cut deep into stone, the Norse settlements clung to the land with stubborn pride. Turf houses pressed low against the wind. Stone churches rose with quiet defiance. Smoke curled from hearths at dawn, proof that life endured even here. For nearly 5 centuries, the Greenland Norse had survived where few others would dare remain. They farmed thin soil, raised cattle through brief summers, and prayed through winters that seemed endless. The eastern settlement and the western settlement were not temporary outposts. They were societies with laws, traditions, and memories passed from parent to child. Children were baptized beneath wooden crosses hauled across the sea. Bells rang on holy days, echoing across frozen valleys. Yet beneath this endurance lay a tension hoe. No one spoke aloud. Each year, the cold lingered longer. Each summer arrived late and left early. Grass grew thinner. Hay stores shrank. These changes did not come as disasters, but as quiet adjustments, the sort that could be explained away until it was too late. The Greenlanders watched the sea as closely as they watched the sky. Ships from Iceland and Norway were more than commerce. They were lifelines. Timber, iron, cloth, and grain arrived with them. News came, too, of kings and wars, of plagues and miracles, of a Europe that felt increasingly distant. When a ship failed to arrive, it unsettled the settlements. When 2 failed, unease settled like frost in the bones. Faith anchored everything. Churches were not just places of worship, but symbols of belonging. The Greenland Norse were Christians, and fiercely so. Their identity depended on it. To abandon their customs would mean becoming something else entirely, and that was unthinkable. Beyond the settlements lived the Inuit, skilled hunters who thrived on seal and whale. Their knowledge could have saved lives, but adopting their ways would have meant surrendering what made the Norse who they were. So the Norse endured. They farmed cattle instead of hunting seals. They built churches instead of adapting shelters. They waited for ships that would surely come, because they always had. In the year 1408, life went on as it always had. At Valsey Church, a wedding took place. The stone walls stood firm, their rough surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind. The bride and groom exchanged vows beneath a wooden cross, darkened by age. Witnesses gathered, their breath visible in the cold air, their voices steady as they spoke the familiar words. This wedding would later become the last confirmed record of the Greenland Norse. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a moment of joy, carved from hardship. Bells rang. Food was shared. Laughter echoed briefly against the stone. No one knew they were standing at the edge of silence. After the wedding, seasons turned as they always had. Winter arrived. Winter, relentless and patient. Livestock were brought into byres for warmth. Hay was measured carefully. Each bundle counted with anxious eyes. People prayed harder, attended church more faithfully, and spoke less about the empty horizon where ships should appear. The western settlement grew quiet first. Farms were abandoned one by one, not in panic, but in resignation. Families consolidated, moving closer together as resources dwindled. No fires burned on distant hills. No smoke rose to greet the sun. The land did not look ravaged. It looked simply unattended, as if its caretakers had stepped away for a moment and never returned. In the eastern settlement, life persisted longer. Churches still held services. Cattle still lived through winters, thin but breathing. The people did not starve suddenly. Hunger crept in gradually, like a slow tightening around the chest. Meals grew smaller. Children stopped growing. Elders weakened. Still, the cattle were not slaughtered. To kill a cow was not just a practical decision. It was a moral one. Livestock represented wealth, stability, and hope for future seasons. Eating them meant admitting there would be no future. It meant surrender. Worse, it meant breaking with traditions that defined them as Christian Europeans, not desperate survivors clinging to the ice. So they waited. They waited for ships that did not come. They waited for summers that did not warm. They waited for God to answer prayers whispered through chapped lips. When European ships finally returned decades later, they found no one waiting. Farms stood empty. Doors hung open. Tools lay rusting where they had last been set down. In churchyards, graves were neatly arranged, each burial done with care. The dead had not fallen in chaos. They had been laid to rest properly, one by one, over time. Inside the churches, there were no signs of violence or flight, no messages scratched into walls, no final confessions, just silence, thick and suffocating. Outside, livestock still wandered. Sheep grazed untended. Cattle moved slowly through overgrown pastures. They were alive, proof that food had existed while people starved. This contradiction would haunt historians for centuries. But in this first chapter of their ending, the Greenland Norse did not see themselves as doomed. They saw themselves as faithful, enduring, waiting for the world to right itself. The ice did not care. It crept closer each year, sealing fjords, choking trade routes, and erasing paths back to Europe. And as the cold tightened its grip, the last light of Norse Greenland dimmed, not with a scream, but with a whisper. The silence did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like frost across a window, beginning at the edges and creeping inward until nothing remained clear. By the time the Greenland Norse understood what was happening, the world they depended on had already moved beyond reach. The ships were supposed to come. They always had, even when storms delayed them. Even when kings changed and wars reshaped Europe, the sea eventually carried sails back to Greenland. This certainty had shaped every decision the settlers made. When the ships failed to arrive one year, it was troubling. When they failed again, it became dangerous. When seasons passed with no sails on the horizon, it became something far worse than danger. It became doubt. Hunger entered the settlements quietly. It was not the sudden shock of famine, but a gradual thinning of life. Portions grew smaller. Meat became scarce. Milk dried up as cattle weakened. Children learned not to ask for more. Adults learned to ignore the ache in their stomachs, and the way dizziness arrived faster each day. What makes this hunger terrifying is not that it existed, but how it was endured. The livestock remained alive. Cattle still breathed in their byres. Sheep still grazed when grass allowed. Goats still bleated in the cold. These animals could have been slaughtered, eaten, and rendered into sustenance that might have carried families through years of hardship. Yet they were not. This was not ignorance. The Norse understood starvation. They had survived centuries of brutal winters. They knew how to preserve meat, how to ration, how to endure scarcity. Their refusal to eat their animals was a choice, repeated again and again, even as bodies weakened and bones grew visible beneath skin. To the Greenland Norse, livestock were not merely food. They were proof of civilization. A cow represented connection to Europe, to farms and feasts and order. To slaughter breeding animals was to admit that the colony had failed, that the future had been cancelled. It was an act of surrender that many could not bring themselves to commit. Faith deepened this paralysis. The church preached endurance, obedience, patience. Suffering was not meaningless. It was a test. Hunger became a trial to be endured rather than a problem to be solved. Eating the last cattle may have felt like betraying both God and identity in a single act. As winters grew harsher, the settlements contracted. Families moved closer together, abandoning distant farms. Empty houses collapsed under snow, their roofs giving way without witnesses. Paths once worn smooth by years of use disappeared beneath ice. The landscape itself seemed to erase human presence. Evidence of desperation began to appear in subtle ways. Leather goods were boiled for nourishment. Dogs vanished, likely eaten in secret, though no records admit it. Tools were repurposed, repaired until metal thinned dangerously. Yet the cattle remained untouched. The Inuit were still there, moving along the edges of Norse territory. They hunted seals and whales, thriving in conditions the Norse found unbearable. Encounters likely occurred. Knowledge could have been exchanged. Survival was possible through adaptation. But adaptation carried a cost that the Norse could not accept. To live like the Inuit would mean abandoning everything that defined them as European, Christians. It would mean becoming something else. So the settlers stood still while the world changed around them. When starvation finally claimed lives, it did so slowly. Bones recovered centuries later showed clear signs of long-term malnutrition. This was not a sudden collapse. People weakened over months and years. They continued attending church. They continued burying their dead with care, wrapping bodies properly, aligning graves neatly. Even in decline, order was preserved. This is perhaps the most chilling detail. There was no panic, no mass graves, no evidence of violence or chaos. The Greenland Norse did not descend into madness. They faded. At some point, the living became fewer than the dead. Entire households vanished. Fires went unlit. Doors were left open because there was no one left to close them. Wind moved through empty rooms, carrying the smell of decay into spaces once warmed by family. Livestock wandered freely. Without human hands to guide them, they grazed until fences fell and pastures blurred into wilderness. Their survival stands as silent testimony to the choices made by the people who once owned them. What happened to the last survivors remains uncertain. Some may have died in their homes, too weak to rise. Others may have left, attempting to walk across ice or sail in fragile boats toward a world that no longer remembered them. A few may have joined Inuit groups, shedding language, faith, and history to survive. If they did, no record would admit it. Such an ending would be worse than death in the eyes of the society they left behind. By the time European ships returned, there was nothing to trade and no one to greet them. The settlers were gone, but not in the way stories expect. No battle scars marked the land. No signs of plague or slaughter explained the emptiness. Only hunger, restraint, and an unwavering refusal to change. The mystery deepens here, not because answers are absent, but because they are uncomfortable. The Greenland Norse were not destroyed by an enemy. They were undone by the weight of their own values, holding fast even as those values slowly starved them into silence. What remains of the Greenland Norse is not found in what they left behind, but in what they refused to become. By the final years of the settlements, the world beyond Greenland had effectively ceased to exist. Europe was no longer a place one could reach. Trade routes were sealed by ice and neglect. Kings changed, borders shifted, but none of it mattered to the people still clinging to the fjords. Their universe had narrowed to a few valleys, a few churches, and a belief that endurance alone would be enough. It was not. The cold tightened its grip without mercy. Sea ice lingered well into seasons that once allowed ships safe passage. Even during summer, the ocean felt hostile, heavy with drifting ice that made sailing suicidal. Greenland had become an island in the truest sense, surrounded not by water, but by isolation. The church remained the final pillar of order. Services continued even as congregations thinned. Hymns echoed through stone halls, filled with more ghosts than people. Faith, once a source of strength, became a boundary no one dared cross. To abandon Christian life would mean admitting that centuries of sacrifice had been for nothing. That admission was too heavy to carry. This is where the ending takes shape, not as a catastrophe, but as a decision repeated quietly across generations. Some died where they had always lived. Their bodies were buried carefully, even when hands were weak and spades barely cut into frozen soil. These were not people who surrendered to chaos. They followed ritual to the end. Even starvation did not break their devotion to order. Others likely made a different choice, one that history does not record. They may have left behind churches, farms, and names, choosing survival over identity. If they joined Inuit groups, they would have shed language, and memory to do so. Such an ending would never be written down. To those who remained, it would be a fate worse than death. The final days of Norse Greenland were not loud. There were no screams carried by the wind, no burning buildings, no last stand against an enemy. The end came in stillness, in unlit fires, in footsteps that never returned, in bells that rusted in silence. When European ships eventually arrived again, they encountered a land that felt abandoned, but not destroyed. The farms were empty, yet intact. Churches stood silent, their doors sometimes ajar, as if waiting for congregations that would never return. Churchyards held the truth, row after row of graves marking a slow, deliberate retreat from life. The bodies told a story written into bone. Long-term starvation. Weakness stretched across years, not weeks. This was not a people overtaken suddenly. It was a people who chose not to change, even as change became the only path to survival. Livestock wandering the land made the silence unbearable. Cattle and sheep moved through former pastures, living proof that food had existed. That contradiction is the key to everything. The Norse did not starve because they lacked resources. They starved because eating those resources meant admitting defeat. In the end, Greenland did not defeat them. Winter did not defeat them. Even isolation did not defeat them. They defeated themselves by clinging too tightly to who they believed they were. The disappearance of the Greenland Norse is not a mystery of violence or invasion. It is a lesson carved into ice. Civilizations do not always fall screaming. Sometimes they kneel, pray, and wait for a rescue that never comes. And when the last prayer fades, when the final fire goes cold, the land does not remember names or beliefs. It simply moves on. The ice closes in. The fjords freeze. The churches stand empty. And a society that once endured for centuries vanishes without leaving a single farewell behind. Venture into the depths of history as we unravel the enigma of the Indus Valley Civilization around 1900 BC. At dawn, the city did not wake in chaos. It breathed. Water slid through covered brick channels beneath the streets, unseen but constant, like a pulse. Above it, footsteps moved in practiced rhythm, merchants opening wooden shutters, potters lifting lids from cooling kilns, children stepping aside as carts rolled past without collision or shouted command. Nothing here felt accidental. The city functioned as if it had been planned not only for people, but for time itself. This was the Indus world at its height, a civilization spread across vast plains and river valleys, home to millions, who shared the same measures, the same bricks, the same ideas of order. Streets met at precise angles. Homes rose in careful tiers, modest in appearance, yet astonishing in design. Almost every house had access to fresh water. Almost every street hid a drainage system capable of carrying waste away cleanly and quietly. These were not luxuries reserved for elites. They were the baseline of daily life. Elsewhere in the ancient world, power announced itself loudly. Kings carved their names into stone. Temples rose toward the sky. Armies marched through city gates to remind citizens who ruled them. Here, power was invisible. No towering palaces dominated the skyline. No grand statues watched from plazas. If rulers existed, they left no monuments. If priests held authority, they built no temples to proclaim it. The city did not advertise who controlled it. Only that control existed. That absence should have felt reassuring. Instead, it unsettled anyone who looked closely. Markets opened with quiet efficiency. Traders exchanged goods measured by standardized weights, small stone cubes identical across cities hundreds of miles apart. Copper, shell, beads, grains, all passed through hands that trusted the system without question. Trust did not need enforcement here. It had been engineered into the environment. When a scale balanced, no one argued. When a seal pressed into clay, no one doubted its training. Those seals were everywhere. Small, carefully carved objects bearing animals, symbols, and lines of script no one today can read. A unicorn-like creature. A bull. A tiger frozen mid-stride. Above them, precise markings arranged with intention. These seals closed packages, marked ownership, confirmed transactions. They were handled daily, passed from hand to hand, pressed into wet clay by people who understood exactly what each symbol meant. To the citizens of the Indus, this writing was ordinary. It labeled goods. It recorded obligations. It authenticated trust. Children likely learned it as naturally as they learned to walk straight streets without stumbling. The script surrounded them, woven into commerce and administration, yet it did not grow into long inscriptions or monumental texts. It stayed small, controlled, concise. Information was shared, but never broadcast. That choice mattered. The cities themselves revealed the same restraint. Homes opened inward, focused on private courtyards rather than the street. Windows rarely faced outside. Life unfolded behind walls, shielded from spectacle. Even public buildings avoided excess. The Great Bath, often cited as ceremonial, was impressive not for decoration, but for precision. Its waterproof bricks and drainage systems showed mastery of engineering, not devotion to display. Everywhere, the same message repeated without words: function over ego, system over personality, continuity over glory. Yet something vital was missing. No walls rose to defend against invasion. No mass weapon caches waited in armories. Tools existed: knives, axes, implements of daily survival. But the machinery of conquest was absent. This was not a society that organized itself around war. If conflict existed, it did not define them. That alone made the Indus civilization an anomaly among Bronze Age cultures. It had achieved scale without spectacle, coordination without coercion, urban life without visible hierarchy. It had solved problems that other civilizations struggled with for centuries: sanitation, urban planning, trade standardization, social order, and still, it spoke softly. Archaeologists would later stand in these same streets and feel the unease settle in. They would map the drainage systems and marvel at their efficiency. They would excavate homes and note how uniformly they were built. They would catalog seals by the thousands, each one hinting at a complex language just out of reach. They would search for evidence of kings, priests, or conquerors, and find nothing conclusive. The city did not explain itself. That silence became heavier the deeper one looked. Civilizations that thrive usually boast. They leave records of victories, laws, divine favor. They justify their existence to future generations, even if only unintentionally. The Indus left no such narrative. It recorded transactions, but not triumphs. It preserved order, but not ideology. It was as if the civilization believed permanence came from systems, not stories. As the sun rose higher, the city moved with calm purpose. Waste vanished beneath the streets. Water flowed where it was needed. Goods traveled along routes that extended far beyond the horizon, reaching lands where different languages were spoken and different gods were worshipped. And yet, the Indus people remained remarkably consistent among themselves. Brick sizes stayed the same across centuries. Weights remained unchanged. Urban layouts followed familiar patterns. Change, when it came, was slow and deliberate. That stability should have guaranteed endurance. It did not. The more perfect the system appears, the more disturbing its eventual silence becomes. Standing in these cities today, one cannot escape the sense that this civilization did not simply live well. It lived carefully, as if it understood something fragile about urban life that others did not. As if it knew that cities could vanish, not through violence, but through choice. In the quiet, symmetry of the streets, in the sealed drains still capable of carrying water after thousands of years, a question lingers without words. What kind of people build a civilization like this and leave behind no explanation of themselves? The answer does not announce itself in broken walls or scorched earth. It waits in the absence, in the missing voices, in a city that functioned flawlessly, then chose not to endure. The first sign of the ending did not announce itself as disaster. No walls fell. No flames climbed the sky. The cities of the Indus did not scream as they died. They simply began to hesitate. A well that once filled reliably each morning took longer to rise. A drainage channel clogged and remained unrepaired for days, then weeks. Bricks used in new construction no longer matched the careful proportions that had defined the cities for centuries. These were small deviations, almost unnoticeable. Yet in a civilization built on precision, Even the smallest inconsistency carried weight. Life continued. Markets opened. Seals were pressed into clay. Water still flowed through most of the streets. But something fundamental had shifted. The certainty that order would always be maintained had softened into expectation rather than assurance. The system still functioned, but it no longer felt inevitable. The change did not strike everywhere at once. Some neighborhoods remained pristine, while others showed quiet neglect. A courtyard wall cracked and went unplastered. A stairwell eroded slightly with each passing season. These were not the marks of panic. They were the signs of attention moving elsewhere. People began to leave, not in crowds, but in families. A household emptied. Another followed. Their possessions were not abandoned in haste. Tools were taken. Portable goods vanished. Even many seals disappeared, carried away by hands that still understood their meaning. What remained were the things too heavy to move: the bricks, the baths, the drains, the architecture itself. No graves filled suddenly. No skeletons lay tangled in doorways. There was no layer of ash sealing the moment in time. Archaeology, which often thrives on catastrophe, found nothing dramatic to hold on to. The Indus cities refused to provide a clean ending. Scholars would later search desperately for an external cause. An invasion seemed logical. Civilizations fall when attacked. Yet no weapons littered the streets. No fortifications bore scars of siege. No mass violence marked the soil. The people who left were not defeated. Natural disaster offered another possibility. Earthquakes, floods, or droughts could scatter populations, but the evidence refused to cooperate. Flood deposits appeared in some places, and not others. Climate patterns shifted gradually, not catastrophically. Rivers changed course slowly, as rivers always do. None of it explained why people would abandon infrastructure that represented generations of labor. The most unsettling truth emerged quietly. This was not a flight. It was a transition. Urban life began to loosen its grip. Large cities thinned. Smaller settlements multiplied. People spread outward into villages, closer to fields, closer to the rhythms of land rather than the abstractions of systems. It was not that they forgot how to build cities. It was that they stopped wanting to live in them. Indoor plumbing, one of humanity's greatest achievements, was left behind without protest. Standardized urban layouts dissolved. The careful grid gave way to organic sprawl. Precision yielded to flexibility. Control yielded to adaptation. And still, no explanation was written. If leaders existed, they did not command a desperate defense of the cities. If councils governed, they did not attempt to preserve the urban core at all costs. The decision appears collective, or at least widely accepted. There is no evidence of resistance to leaving, no sign of internal collapse tearing the society apart. This is a terrifying possibility. What if the Indus people did not lose their cities, but evaluated them and chose another path? Trade networks weakened, but did not vanish overnight. Contacts with distant regions faded gradually, as if participation became optional rather than essential. The great exchange of goods slowed, then narrowed, then localized. The world shrank by design. The cities emptied without becoming ruins. They were not destroyed. They were simply allowed to stand, unused, like tools set aside. Streets remained walkable. Drains remained functional. Walls remained upright. The silence that followed was not violent. It was intentional. One cannot escape the impression that something was understood, a risk, a realization, a cost of complexity that outweighed its benefits. Perhaps environmental pressures made centralized living inefficient. Perhaps social systems strained under scale. Or perhaps the very success of urban life revealed vulnerabilities that smaller communities could avoid. Whatever the reason, the choice was widespread and consistent. This was not a single city failing. It was an entire civilization stepping back from its greatest invention. The most chilling detail lies in what they preserved. They carried their knowledge of farming, craftsmanship, and daily survival into the countryside. But the urban blueprint did not follow. The precise city planning did not migrate intact. It was as if the knowledge was deliberately not passed on in full. Civilizations often collapse in chaos. The Indus faded in coordination. Standing in the abandoned streets today, one feels the absence not as loss, but as restraint. The people who lived here were capable of maintaining these cities. They proved it for centuries. Their departure was not forced by incompetence or defeat. It was a decision made quietly and carried out completely. Long after the streets emptied and the baths fell silent, the seals remained. They surfaced from the soil one by one, pulled from ruined homes, workshops, forgotten storerooms, small objects, easily overlooked, yet impossibly dense with meaning. Each seal carried an image, an animal poised in deliberate stillness, and above it, a line of symbols carved with care. The same symbols appeared again and again across cities separated by vast distances. Consistency without explanation, order without translation. This was the final trace of the Indus mind, and it refused to speak. Thousands of inscriptions have been recovered. None of them are long. None tell stories. None announce laws, victories, or divine favor. There is no Rosetta Stone waiting in the dust. No bilingual text to bridge the gap. Whatever this script conveyed, it was never meant to endure beyond its users. That fact alone is unsettling. Writing systems are among humanity's most durable technologies. Even when empires fall, their languages often persist, reshaped, but recognizable. Sumerian survived its cities. Egyptian hieroglyphs outlived the pharaohs. The Indus script vanished completely. Not distorted, not borrowed, not adapted. It ended. The people who left the cities carried knowledge with them. They knew how to farm. They knew how to shape tools. They knew how to survive. But they did not carry their writing forward in any recognizable form. It did not evolve. It did not simplify. It did not fracture into dialects. It stopped. This suggests an ending far more deliberate than simple decline. Literacy existed. Administration existed. The choice not to preserve the script implies either a collapse so thorough that transmission became impossible, or a withdrawal so intentional that transmission was deemed unnecessary or dangerous. The seals themselves deepen the mystery. They appear designed for control and verification. Ownership, authorization, accountability. A system that depends on shared understanding. When the cities were abandoned, that system lost its function. Without centralized trade, without dense urban exchange, the script became weight without purpose, and so it was allowed to die. Later cultures rose on the same land. New languages flourished. New traditions formed. Yet none claimed inheritance of the Indus system. There is no myth of fallen cities passed down in legend. No remembered golden age. No recorded lament for what was lost. Silence replaced continuity. Modern scholars strain against that silence, attempting to decode meaning from patterns, frequencies, repetitions. They debate whether the script represents language at all, or something else entirely. A system of signs, a form of classification, a symbolic shorthand known only to those trained within it. Every theory collapses under the same weight. There is not enough context because the context was never meant to survive. This is the final, unsettling possibility. The Indus civilization did not merely abandon its cities. It closed a door behind itself. By leaving no explanation, no narrative, no ideological residue, it denied the future access to its reasoning. We can measure their bricks. We can trace their drains. We can map their trade routes. But we cannot reconstruct their decision-making because they did not encode it in stone or story. The civilization trusted systems, not memory. And systems, once unused, decay without complaint. Standing among the ruins today, one feels that absence acutely. The cities do not feel destroyed. They feel concluded. As if the people who built them reached the end of a chapter and chose not to write the next one in the same place or in the same language. This runs against every instinct modern societies hold. We believe progress is cumulative. That advancement must be preserved, expanded, defended. The Indus people challenge that assumption. They demonstrate that a civilization can step away from complexity without chaos, and from permanence without regret. Yet the cost of that choice echoes across time, because without their language, we cannot ask them why. We do not know what fear guided them, if fear played any role at all. We do not know what trade-offs they calculated, what dangers they anticipated, or what future they envisioned outside their cities. We only know that they acted together, quietly and completely. The seals remain, mute witnesses to a conversation we will never hear, symbols without sound, meaning without voice. In the end, the greatest mystery of the Indus Valley is not why the cities were abandoned. It is why the people ensured we would never understand the answer. Let's travel to the heart of the American Southwest to uncover the ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon, around 1150 AD. In the heart of the vast, unforgiving desert, Chaco Canyon rose like an ancient monument to human ingenuity. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting harsh shadows across the labyrinth of stone. A quiet hum of reverence echoed through the arid expanse as a civilization, once thriving in its brilliance, left behind its mark. Massive ceremonial structures, built from millions of precisely cut stones, stretched toward the sky. These stone buildings, with their astronomical precision, aligned perfectly with the stars above. They stood not just as shelters, but as gateways to another realm. A realm in which the people of Chaco had mastered both the earth and the heavens. The ancestral Puebloans were more than just builders. They were visionaries. The roads they carved into the desert stretched for hundreds of miles, their straight lines defying the chaos of the natural world. They did not simply wander aimlessly in the desert. They created pathways that connected far-flung communities, each road a deliberate thread in the fabric of a vast and complex society. It was an empire, though not in the traditional sense of the word. This empire was bound not by armies, but by stone and spirit. Chaco Canyon was not a place of mere survival. It was a place of profound purpose. The people who lived here were driven by something deeper than the mundane needs of daily life. They built their roads, their buildings, and their rituals with an understanding of the cosmos. Their observatories, tall towers that pierced the skyline, were aligned with the celestial movements. They tracked the stars with the precision of mathematicians, marking the passage of time, the changing seasons, and the cycles of life. They had not just mastered the earth beneath their feet, but also the stars above. The community was tightly woven, each person contributing to the grand vision of the canyon. Whether in the construction of great houses, massive structures with walls that seemed to touch the sky, or in the carving of roads that led to distant settlements, every action was intentional. Chaco was a hub, a center of trade, culture, and spiritual power, and for a time, it flourished. The heart of Chaco was a great house known as Pueblo Bonito. This was the jewel of the canyon, a structure so grand that it defied imagination. 4 stories tall, the walls of Pueblo Bonito housed hundreds of rooms, where artisans, priests, and leaders alike gathered to perform sacred rituals. The air was thick with the incense of ceremonial fires, the sound of chants that rose into the sky like a prayer to the stars. The people of Chaco believed they were in constant communication with the heavens, their ceremonies acting as a bridge between the divine and the mortal. But there was a dark undercurrent to the story of Chaco Canyon, a force that would unravel this carefully woven society. Beneath the surface of Chaco's grand architecture and celestial alignments, something was brewing. The very perfection of the society seemed to leave no room for error, and as the people of Chaco built their great empire, it seemed they had forgotten one simple truth. Nothing in this world, not even the most elaborate of plans, can withstand the weight of its own ambition. In the years leading up to the fall of Chaco, the signs of a collapse began to appear. The roads, which once radiated outward in perfect symmetry, were left unfinished. Their straight lines became lost in the sand, leading to nowhere. And as the great houses were constructed with painstaking care, many were left incomplete, abandoned mid-construction, as if the builders had simply vanished into thin air. There was no word of warning, no sign of the end. It was as though a great silence had descended upon the people of Chaco, one that would remain unbroken until the truth of their disappearance could no longer be ignored. The first cracks in the empire were small, almost imperceptible, but like the slow erosion of stone, they would grow. And when they did, Chaco would be forever changed. The skies would darken, the stars would shift, and the once thriving heart of the ancestral Puebloans would become a silent witness to an unknown catastrophe. What had driven them to this point? What had caused the people to abandon their greatest creation, their finest hour? The sun set over the ruins of Chaco Canyon, casting long shadows over the abandoned structures. The roads, once so carefully planned, now seemed to stretch into nothingness, leading nowhere. The wind whispered through the empty spaces of the great houses, as if the canyon itself was mourning the loss of a civilization that had reached for the stars, only to fall short. The final years of Chaco Canyon were a time of darkness, though the skies above still shimmered with the cold light of the stars. Once a beacon of civilization, the great city now lay at the mercy of forces unseen, forces that would tear it apart from within. As the years passed, the once thriving center of culture, power, and knowledge seemed to unravel before the very eyes of those who called it home. The ceremonial structures, grand and awe-inspiring, were abandoned mid-construction. Roads that had once connected distant peoples now stretched endlessly toward empty horizons, their purpose forgotten. What had happened to Chaco? What force had fractured this carefully constructed world? The signs of unrest were subtle at first, whispers in the wind, fleeting shadows in the corners of the canyon. It began with the sudden departure of the leaders, the priests, and the builders, who had been the backbone of Chaco's society. One by one, they disappeared, leaving behind nothing but silence and uncertainty. The people who remained were left in a state of confusion, unsure of the future or how to rebuild the fractured society around them. In the absence of direction, chaos began to fester. The roads, once a symbol of unity, now became paths of isolation. Communities that had once been connected by these roads now grew more distant, cut off from each other by the very infrastructure that had once bound them together. At the heart of this unraveling, the great houses of Chaco stood frozen in time, their walls silent witnesses to the storm that was tearing apart the very fabric of the community. It was here that the first signs of violence emerged. What had once been a society of harmony and purpose now descended into conflict. The people, desperate for answers, turned on each other. Old alliances dissolved, and mistrust spread like wildfire. The sound of hammers and chisels, which had once resonated throughout the canyon as workers carved stone to build the future, was replaced by the clash of weapons. The great houses, once sanctuaries of knowledge and spirituality, became battlegrounds where desperate factions fought for control. And then, the violence escalated. Bodies were found scattered across the canyon, their remains bearing the unmistakable signs of extreme brutality. Some were dismembered, their limbs torn from their bodies in a way that spoke of a cruelty beyond comprehension. Others were burned, their bodies charred and blackened by flames that had consumed not just their flesh, but their very essence. It was as if the people of Chaco had descended into madness, their once proud civilization collapsing under the weight of fear, violence, and a thirst for power. The very streets that had once led to unity now served as the final battlegrounds, where blood was spilled in the name of survival. The violence was not the result of an external threat, as many had feared. No invading army had come to tear down Chaco's walls. No foreign conquerors had entered the canyon to claim the riches within. Instead, it was the people themselves who had become the enemy. The internal collapse was more insidious than any foreign invader. It was the decay of a society from within, where fear and paranoia festered in the absence of leadership and unity. As the violence reached its peak, something more unsettling occurred. The people of Chaco began to scatter. Entire families, once bound by ties of kinship and culture, fled the canyon. But they did not flee in unity or toward a single destination. Instead, they splintered, disappearing into the wilderness, each group taking a different path, each person seeking a future that would never come. The roads that had once connected them now became symbols of their separation. The great houses, once filled with the hum of life and the chants of ritual, now stood empty, cold and silent. But even in their scattering, there was an eerie sense of finality. It was as though the people knew their civilization was finished, that there was no hope of recovery. The very fabric of Chaco had torn apart, and its people were scattered like the pieces of a shattered mirror. Those who remained did not rebuild. They did not return to the city in search of their lost culture. Instead, they disappeared into the winds of time, leaving behind nothing but the ruins of what had once been. The canyon, once a thriving center of life, now stood as a hollow shell. The stone walls of the great houses echoed only with the wind, and the roads, once a sign of unity, now stretched into nothingness. The silence that had fallen over Chaco was suffocating. It was as if the land itself had swallowed the people who had dared to build so boldly in its midst. The mystery of Chaco Canyon deepened with every passing year as the world outside the canyon moved on, leaving the desert to hold the secrets of a forgotten empire. Time has a way of erasing the past, of burying the truth beneath layers of dust and history. Yet, even as centuries passed, Chaco Canyon remained a place of whispers. Its massive ruins, half crumbled by time, still stood defiant against the desert winds. Though abandoned long ago, the mystery of its sudden collapse never faded. Archaeologists, historians, and curious souls from every corner of the world came to Chaco to uncover the truth. They combed through the rubble, carefully examining every stone and every broken artifact, but the answers they sought remained elusive. What had happened here? Why had a civilization, so advanced and so powerful, vanished without a trace? What had driven the people to abandon their magnificent creation and scatter like leaves in the wind? The modern-day explorers who ventured into Chaco Canyon found themselves surrounded by a chilling silence. The ruins stood like ghosts, their walls scarred by time, yet the air seemed thick with the weight of untold stories. It was as if the very land had absorbed the pain, the fear, and the violence that had once torn the people of Chaco apart. The evidence of their final days was everywhere, but it raised more questions than answers. What had led to the internal collapse? Was it famine, a devastating drought that ravaged their crops and caused the community to turn on each other? Or was it something more sinister, something buried deep within the hearts of the people themselves? In the years leading up to the fall of Chaco, tensions had risen, not only within the city, but in the surrounding pueblos as well. Was there a deep-seated rivalry among the various factions? Could it be that the once unified people of Chaco had fractured into warring clans, each seeking control of the spiritual and material wealth that the city had accumulated? The evidence was compelling. The bodies found within the great houses were not only dismembered, but showed signs of ritualistic violence. Some had their hands and feet severed, while others bore the unmistakable marks of sacrificial offerings. The more the archaeologists uncovered, the more it seemed that the people of Chaco had turned on themselves, driven to madness by fear, hunger, and an insatiable lust for power. But it wasn't just the violence that was disturbing. It was the fact that, despite everything, the survivors had vanished, without a trace. The scattering of the people, their seemingly random exodus into the wilderness, was perhaps the most unsettling part of the mystery. No one knew where they had gone, or why they had left in such disarray. Some stories, passed down through generations, spoke of survivors wandering into the desert, never to be seen again. Others whispered of secretive journeys to faraway lands, where the people sought refuge and a new beginning. Yet despite these tales, no concrete evidence ever surfaced. The people of Chaco were gone, and no one could say where they had gone or why they had left in such haste. There were pueblos to the south, in modern-day New Mexico, whose inhabitants still refused to speak of Chaco. These people, some said, carried the memory of their ancestors' dark past, a past that was too painful to confront. They spoke in hushed tones about the canyon, about the horrors that had befallen the people who had lived there. But they said little more. For generations, the history of Chaco remained a taboo subject, a memory too haunting to revisit. What had happened at Chaco, it seemed, was a wound that had never healed, a scar that had been left to fester in silence. Today, the ruins of Chaco Canyon remain a powerful symbol of human ambition and tragedy. The stone walls and roads, which once connected communities and spanned the desert, now lie abandoned, their purpose forgotten. The astronomical observatories that once tracked the stars, guiding the people of Chaco in their rituals, now stand as silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of a civilization lost to time. And yet, despite the years, the mystery remains. What caused the downfall of Chaco Canyon? Was it nature, war, or something far darker, a force that came from within the very heart of its people? The unanswered questions linger, haunting the desert like the shadows of a forgotten empire. Chaco Canyon, though silent, speaks to those who listen closely. It is a place that holds its secrets tight, waiting for those brave enough to uncover the truth. And perhaps, in time, someone will finally unravel the mystery of Chaco Canyon, the reason for its rise, its glory, and its sudden, violent fall. Until then, the canyon will stand as a testament to what was once and what might have been. Dive into the ancient wonders of the Minoans of Crete, around 1450 BC. The island of Crete, in the Mediterranean, gleamed under the heat of the midsummer sun, its whitewashed walls and terracotta roofs standing in stark contrast to the deep blue of the sea. The Minoan civilization, Europe's first great society, had flourished here for centuries, carving out an existence of unmatched splendor. The air was thick with the scent of salt, honey, and olives, a testament to the prosperity that had made this island the beating heart of a civilization that seemed impervious to danger. There was nothing they feared, not even the gods. At the center of this world was the sprawling palace of Knossos, an architectural marvel with its labyrinthine halls and vibrant frescoes. The palace was a palace in every sense, grand, opulent, and alive with movement. Servants hustled through its corridors, carrying messages and offerings. Priests performed rituals in its shrines, and traders filled the air with the sharp scent of fine linens and metals from foreign lands. The pulse of Crete's greatness beat strongest here, where bull-leaping ceremonies were painted in bold, brilliant colors on the walls, where the gods were not only worshipped, but intimately woven into the fabric of life. In the heart of Knossos, the towering frescoes seemed to pulse with life. The figures of bull-leapers, caught mid-air in graceful leaps, painted the walls in vibrant hues of red, orange, and gold. The symbol of the bull was central to their faith. To leap over the backs of these massive creatures was not only a display of bravery, it was a divine act, a dance with the gods themselves. In the grand court of the palace, Minoans held festivals to honor the goddess, with sacrifices, music, and dances that would echo through the generations. Lydia, a young scholar of the royal family, wandered the halls of Knossos with a sense of awe. She was no warrior, no priestess, but her mind sought the mysteries buried beneath the surface of Minoan culture. She stood before a fresco, her fingers tracing the smooth, almost lifelike images of men and women engaged in a bull-leaping ritual. A chill ran through her as she gazed at the bull's eyes, wide, fierce, and unsettling. The gods, she knew, were capricious, and their favor could be fleeting. In the library of the palace, Lydia pored over ancient scrolls, texts, and inscriptions. Among them, the mysterious linear. A script baffled her. Unlike the familiar linear B, which had already been decoded by later generations of Greeks, linear A remained a puzzle. Its symbols, elegant yet elusive, mocked her efforts. The Minoans were a people who had mastered countless arts. They created flush toilets long before the Greeks or Romans, engineered complex drainage systems, and perfected their craft in pottery and metalwork. Yet their most fundamental secret, their language, remained hidden from the world. To Lydia, this enigma was as intoxicating as it was maddening. She had spent countless hours combing through fragments of pottery, clay tablets, and scrolls. Her heart raced each time she thought she might decipher a new symbol, only to realize that the meanings were as obscure as ever. Yet the more she delved into their writings, the more it became clear that there was something profound buried within these markings. There was a story here, a story that might explain not only the culture of the Minoans, but their unshakable confidence, their apparent fearlessness. Her mentor, Theras, had long warned her about the dangers of obsession. "There is no power in what cannot be understood," he would say, his voice tinged with the wisdom of age. Yet Lydia was drawn to the mystery like a moth to a flame. She had to know. If she could crack the code of Linear A, she might unlock the secrets of their civilization, and with it, the truth behind their seemingly perfect society. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the palace grounds, Lydia walked along the edge of the grand courtyard, her thoughts heavy with the weight of her work. The once unthinkable idea of deciphering Linear A had become a possibility, and she could feel it in her bones. But as the evening shadows grew deeper, a chill touched the air. Lydia's footsteps slowed, her gaze lifted to the sky. A sudden unease settled in her chest. Far off on the horizon, above the mountains to the north, a thick plume of smoke began to rise. It was not an ordinary cloud. It was dark, twisting, unnatural. A storm was coming. But it was not the storm of the gods that Lydia had heard whispered in the streets. It was something far more terrifying, something she could not yet understand. The morning after Lydia had seen the smoke, the island of Crete seemed eerily still. The air was thick with the heat of summer, yet there was a coldness to it, an unsettling chill that settled deep in the bones. The markets of Knossos, usually vibrant with traders and tourists, were quiet. The palace courtyard, once filled with the noise of life, was now silent, as though the very earth itself had paused, waiting for something. Lydia stood at the palace gates, staring at the horizon where the strange plume of smoke had been the night before. It was still there, darker now, like a veil of destruction slowly descending over the land. There was no sound of thunder, no sign of a storm. And yet, there was something ominous in the air, something unnatural. Her thoughts returned to the frescoes she had studied so many times, the images of bull leaping, the gods, and the great storm that had appeared in one of the murals. Her heart quickened with a sense of foreboding, as if the signs had always been there, waiting for her to understand them. In the weeks that followed, the island descended into chaos. The smoke from the north thickened, becoming an ever-present reminder of the uncertainty creeping toward Crete. The Minoan fleet, usually so grand and unstoppable, began to retreat into the harbor, its ships anchored in silence. No one spoke of what was happening, but Lydia could feel the unease in the air, thick and suffocating. The people who had once walked with their heads held high, with an almost arrogant confidence, now moved with a sense of urgency and fear. Then, on one fateful night, the storm came. It was not the storm of the gods, not a thunderous wrath to punish the wicked. This storm was different. It came without warning, crashing upon the shores of Crete with such violence that the earth seemed to tremble beneath it. Waves rose higher than any Lydia had ever seen, swallowing entire villages and crashing against the walls of the palace itself. The once untouchable island seemed to flinch under the fury of the ocean, as though it were being torn apart. Lydia had been in the palace when the first waves hit. The ground shook violently, and the windows rattled in their frames. At first, she thought it was an earthquake, but then, as the sky darkened and the waves rose higher, she realized that this was no ordinary disaster. The waves were not natural. They were massive, like something summoned by the very hands of the gods. But no storm, no matter how powerful, could explain the sheer magnitude of what was happening. It was as if the island was being ripped away from the world. The palace was in chaos. Servants screamed as they rushed through the halls, trying to gather the royal family and flee to safety. The courtyards that had once been so full of life were now drowned in water, the great frescoes on the walls now mere shadows beneath the rising tide. Lydia ran through the corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find her family. She had to survive. As she emerged from the palace, the sight that met her was beyond anything she could have imagined. The once thriving city of Knossos was now a smoldering ruin. Fires burned where the waves had not reached, and the streets were eerily quiet. The once untouchable Minoans were now scattered, panicked, and desperate. The entire civilization, its culture, its history, seemed to be slipping away before her eyes. Lydia's mind raced. The tsunami had come, yes, but it was the aftermath that troubled her. The fires that burned in the distance were unlike any fire caused by natural disaster. It wasn't just the destruction, it was the way it had been carried out. Methodical, almost intentional. It was as though the destruction of the Minoans had been planned, and the waves were only the beginning. In the days that followed, the truth became undeniable. The Minoans were gone. The great palaces had burned, and the population had vanished. No one knew where they had gone, or if they had even survived. Some believed that the eruption of Thera had caused the tsunami that devastated the island, but that didn't explain why entire cities had been burned to the ground, or why no trace of the population remained. Lydia, now one of the last survivors, wandered the desolate streets of Knossos. There was no one left to ask, no one left to explain what had happened. Only the echoes of a once great civilization remained. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the remains of a mural, the colors now faded, the images worn by the passing of time. The gods had abandoned them. The island had swallowed them whole, and there was no one left to tell the story. And then, in the midst of the ruin, Lydia discovered something that chilled her to the bone. Beneath the ashes and the debris, hidden away in a chamber beneath the palace, she found a tablet. It was an inscribed fragment of Linear A. The script was familiar, yet foreign, and her heart skipped a beat as she realized that it was one of the last remnants of their civilization. But there was something off about it. The symbols were arranged in a way that she had never seen before, a warning, perhaps, or a clue to the disaster that had befallen them. Lydia clutched the tablet, a single thought echoing in her mind. What had they known, and why had they left no trace behind? The island was silent, as if it had swallowed its secrets whole. Knossos, once the shining jewel of the Minoan Empire, now lay in ruins, its grand palaces reduced to smoking husks. The people who had once filled the streets, celebrated their gods, and leaped over bulls with grace were now nothing but echoes in the wind. No one remained to explain the calamity. No one to tell Lydia why it had all ended so suddenly. All that was left were the ruins and the unanswered questions that gnawed at her mind. Lydia wandered through the desolate city, her every step seeming to stir up memories of a civilization lost to time. The smell of smoke still clung to the air, mingling with the salt of the sea. Her fingers brushed the remnants of murals, their once vivid colors now faded and cracked. The frescoes told stories of gods, of bulls, of beauty, but they were now hollow, their meaning slipping further away with every passing hour. In the days since the storm, Lydia had found little more than devastation. The Minoans had vanished as suddenly as they had risen, leaving behind no clear answers. Theories abounded, yet none explained the whole of it. The eruption of Thera had caused the tsunami, yes, but why had the palaces burned? Why had the population disappeared, leaving no trace? It was as though the Minoans had simply ceased to exist, like a dream fading upon waking. But then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lydia made a discovery that would change everything. In the heart of Colossus, beneath the ashes and rubble, she found an ancient burial site, hidden away, as though it had been deliberately sealed off. The site was unlike anything she had ever seen. The tombs were arranged in a circular formation, each one larger than the last, and the bodies were buried in strange, twisted positions. It was as though the dead had been laid to rest in a hurry, forced into their graves by something catastrophic. There was no sign of burial, rituals, no offerings to the gods, just an unsettling sense of finality. Lydia approached the first tomb, her heart racing. She had seen graves before, but never anything like this. The bodies had been buried hastily, some of them not even fully covered. It was as if the Minoans had known their end was coming and had tried to flee in the final moments, only to be caught in the chaos. Her hands shook as she uncovered the first body. It was that of a man, his face frozen in a grimace of terror. His eyes were wide open, as though he had died in the midst of a struggle. Lydia recoiled, her stomach churning. This was no peaceful death. This was a violent end. She moved to the next tomb. Again, the body was that of a man, but this one had been buried with a strange, ceremonial mask placed over his face. The mask was made of gold, and the intricate design suggested that he had been of high status, perhaps a priest or a noble. But why was he buried here, among the others, with no sign of honor, no sign of reverence? It didn't make sense. As Lydia continued to uncover the graves, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The bodies were all in the same disarrayed positions, as though they had been thrown into their tombs without ceremony. The rich and the poor alike, the priests and the commoners, all laid to rest in the same chaotic fashion. There was no rhyme or reason to it, no order, no structure. And then she found it, a tablet, half buried beneath the ashes of the final tomb. Her breath caught in her throat as she knelt beside it, brushing away the dirt and dust. It was a fragment of Linear A, the script that had eluded scholars for centuries. This was the answer, the key to the mystery. She could feel it in her bones. The symbols on the tablet were unlike any she had seen before. They were familiar, yet strange, as though they had been written in a language just out of reach. But there was something different about this tablet. It was not simply a record of the Minoans' achievements or daily life. It was a warning, a message from the past. As Lydia studied the symbols, her pulse quickened. She could make out a few words, words that sent a chill through her body. The great storm will come when the sea turns red. The gods will abandon us, and we will be no more. The tablet was a prophecy, a warning from the Minoans themselves. They had known that their end was coming. They had known that the storm would come, and when it did, they would vanish from the earth, taking their secrets with them. The gods had not abandoned them. They had known the Minoans would fall, and the Minoans had prepared for it, sealing away their most sacred knowledge in the hope that someday someone would uncover it. But the truth was even darker than Lydia could have imagined. The Minoans had not been wiped out by the storm. They had left. They had fled the island, taking their knowledge, their culture, and their language with them. They had abandoned Crete, not because they feared death, but because they knew the truth. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Lydia stood in the ruined city, the tablet in her hands, her mind reeling. The Minoans had not been destroyed. They had vanished, hidden their secrets in the shadows of history. And now, as the winds whispered through the ruins, Lydia understood that the story of the Minoans was far from over. They had taken their secrets with them, and one day, perhaps, those secrets would be revealed once more. But for now, all that remained was silence. And the lingering question, where had the Minoans gone? Journey to the majestic city of Petra as we explore the legacy of the Nabateans around 700 AD. Petra was a city that should not have existed. A jewel nestled in the heart of the Jordanian desert, it rose like a mirage, a spectacular, rose-red city carved into the rock itself. No natural formations could explain its beauty. No simple architecture could account for its scale. It was a city that felt timeless, as though the desert had decided to bless its harsh expanse with something remarkable. The sheer ingenuity of its creation made it seem as if the city had been woven from the very fabric of the earth, shaped not by nature, but by hands that understood its deepest secrets. This was the home of the Nabateans, an enigmatic people whose legacy was as mysterious as the city itself. A nomadic tribe turned master engineers, they controlled the lifeblood of the desert, water. While other civilizations struggled with the barren wasteland, the Nabateans tamed it, turning it into a thriving, prosperous kingdom that stood at the crossroads of trade between the East and West. Their knowledge of hydrology was unrivaled. They built intricate water systems, cisterns, aqueducts, and channels that captured and distributed the precious commodity of water with surgical precision. The city's towering facades, intricately carved into the pink sandstone, spoke of a civilization at the height of its power. The treasury, with its ornate columns and grandiose entrance, loomed like a silent sentinel over the city's heart. Inside, the walls whispered secrets of a time when the Nabateans controlled vast trade routes from the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean. They prospered, not merely by conquering land, but by mastering the elements. They didn't need to be warriors. They were merchants, diplomats, engineers. They bent the desert to their will. And yet, despite all their brilliance, despite their near-mystical grasp on the harsh environment that surrounded them, the Nabateans left no lasting trace. They had the riches of the world at their feet: gold, incense, spices, but no records of their triumphs beyond what their architecture told. No written history survived their era. No epic battles, no grand leaders, no lasting treaties. The world knew the Nabateans, but only through their grand stone city, which seemed to endure even as their people faded from history's view. What was even more unnerving was the way they disappeared. There was no sudden disaster, no plague that wiped them out, no violent invasion that decimated their ranks, no dramatic collapse like that of the Maya or the ancient Egyptians. One day, they were there, their city bustling with life. The next, they simply vanished. Historians and archaeologists were left with the same question: where did they go? Some speculated that perhaps they had been absorbed into the surrounding cultures, that they had become one with the Byzantine Empire or the Arab tribes that swept through the region. But there were no records of a mass migration, No proof that the Nabateans had been lost to history in such a way. There were no survivors to speak of, no descendant communities that carried on their traditions, no linguistic remnants in the languages of the people that followed them. All that remained were the ruins of Petra, standing tall against the ravages of time. The city's water systems, some of the most sophisticated the ancient world had ever seen, continued to work, though no one knew how. They still flowed, channeling water through the dry desert like a living pulse. But who had created these marvels? Who had crafted this oasis in the midst of such a brutal environment? And why did they leave behind no heirs? The silence was deafening. The more historians dug, the more they unearthed not just the secrets of a long-lost people, but an eerie absence. There were no funerary records, no monuments to rulers, no signs of conquest or death. It was as though the Nabateans had made a conscious decision to fade from the world entirely, to erase themselves from history without a trace. And yet, Petra stood, a city as alive as the desert would allow it to be. It was not just a city. It was a riddle, carved into the earth and left behind as a testament to a people who had mastered the harshest environment known to man. But in their mastery, they had left an unnerving truth. The Nabateans had not just built a city, they had built a mystery, one that still lingered long after their disappearance. It was a puzzle that defied every historian, every archaeologist, every curious mind who ventured into the heart of Petra. The Nabateans had not fallen to war, nor had they faced a plague that erased their existence. There was no great battle, no written account of their demise. They did not go out with a bang. There was no grand event marking their end. It was as if they had simply stopped. The last records of the Nabateans were vague at best. The Roman Empire, which had absorbed much of their territory by the early part of the 7th century, made no mention of a battle for Petra. The Byzantines, too, seemed uninterested in the people who had once controlled the trade routes of the Arabian desert. It was as if the Nabateans had vanished not in defeat, but by choice. Their presence, once vibrant and undeniable, had simply dwindled away, like a flame slowly suffocated by an invisible hand. But the city itself, Petra, was still there, standing strong against the ravages of time. The tombs, temples, and dwellings were intact, their structures untouched by any invader. The famous treasury, with its majestic columns and elaborate carvings, stood in defiant beauty. But there was something eerily silent about the place. Even the once bustling marketplaces, where traders had once exchanged exotic goods from across the ancient world, seemed frozen in time. No voices echoed in the streets. No merchants hawked their wares. No children played in the shadows of the great rock walls. There was no sign of life. The Nabateans had not simply faded from the earth. It was more as though they had made a collective decision to step back, to disappear, and no one could understand why. Was it something spiritual? Was there a shared belief, a prophecy, a vision that led them to vanish? Some theorists suggested that the Nabateans had foreseen their own demise. They had seen the winds of change, the rise of Islam, the shifting tides of trade and politics, and had chosen to leave behind no heirs. The idea that they had orchestrated their own vanishing was unsettling, like an artist deliberately destroying their masterpiece. Yet there were no records to confirm this theory, no inscriptions, no written accounts from the Nabateans themselves. The people who had once been so meticulous in their ability to control their environment, who had mastered water systems that seemed to defy nature, had left nothing behind. No explanation, no farewell, no clue to the motive behind their disappearance. In fact, the more researchers scoured the remnants of Petra, the more they realized how much the Nabateans had left behind. The grandeur of the city was only the beginning. Beneath the surface, the intricate water systems continued to function flawlessly. The aqueducts, channels, and cisterns still supplied water to the desert. It was as if the city itself were still alive, pumping water through its veins like blood. But the people who had built these marvels were nowhere to be found. And what was even more unsettling was that no one seemed to know how it was possible. The sophistication of the waterworks suggested an advanced understanding of engineering and hydrology, knowledge that had been lost to time. How had they done it? And why had they left it behind, intact and still functional, with no one to tend to it? Some claimed that the water systems were merely relics of a bygone age, that their continued operation was a coincidence of nature. But the more researchers looked, the less that seemed plausible. These were not systems that could simply run themselves. They were too precise, too intentional. It was clear that whoever had designed them had a deep understanding of the desert's rhythms, of how to capture and store water in an unforgiving environment. Yet even with all their knowledge, the Nabateans had vanished without a trace. The mystery deepened with each passing year. Petra remained silent, beautiful, a city frozen in time. But the people who had once called it home were gone. There were no descendants, no remnants of their culture left behind. No new civilization had emerged from the ashes of Petra to carry on the Nabatean legacy. It was as though they had simply chosen to disappear. But why? And how? Was their disappearance part of a grander plan, or was it the result of some dark, unseen force? The unanswered questions swirled in the minds of those who ventured into Petra, leaving them with only one truth. The Nabateans, for all their brilliance, had left behind a riddle that would never be solved. The years passed, and the enigma of the Nabateans only deepened. Scholars, archaeologists, and adventurers all came to Petra seeking answers, but what they found only led to more questions. The city's grandeur remained, like an ancient puzzle whose pieces had been scattered across time. But the people who had built it, the brilliant engineers, traders, and architects, remained a shadow in history, as elusive as the desert winds that scoured the city's stone streets. Their sudden disappearance had left no trace, no survivors, no clear reason. They had simply chosen to vanish, like ghosts into the desert sands. Petra's water systems, however, continued to work flawlessly. Centuries had passed, and still the water flowed, through aqueducts, channels, and cisterns, just as the Nabateans had designed it. But there were no Nabateans left to maintain it. No one could explain how this delicate, intricate network continued to function when all those who had built it were gone. The secret behind their engineering genius remained locked in the heart of the desert, tantalizingly close, yet forever out of reach. It wasn't until the early years of the 21st century that a breakthrough came. A team of researchers, led by an ambitious young archaeologist named Omar, uncovered a long-buried chamber beneath the treasury, a chamber that had been concealed for centuries. It was here, in the depths of Petra's rock, that Omar's team discovered something that would forever change their understanding of the Nabateans. The chamber was not a tomb, as they had first suspected. Instead, it contained a vast collection of ancient scrolls and inscriptions, written in a language that no one had seen before. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple form of early Nabatean script, but closer examination revealed something far more remarkable. The symbols were a hybrid, a unique combination of ancient scripts, some familiar, others utterly alien. It was as though the Nabateans had developed a new form of writing in the final years of their civilization. And within this strange language, a pattern emerged, a message that hinted at the reason for their disappearance. Omar and his team worked tirelessly to decipher the inscriptions, and after months of painstaking effort, they uncovered a chilling truth. The Nabateans had not been wiped out by war, famine, or plague. They had not been absorbed into neighboring cultures. Instead, they had chosen to disappear, but not in the way anyone had imagined. The inscriptions described a radical act, a decision made by the leaders of Petra, a decision to sever all ties with the world. They had deliberately chosen to erase their existence, to vanish from history's memory, and to leave behind only the city and its water systems as a final, enduring legacy. The reason for this extraordinary decision was found in a passage that spoke of a vision that had come to the Nabatean elders in the final years of their civilization. The vision was apocalyptic, a warning of a coming change that would alter the course of humanity forever. The elders believed that the rise of a new power in the region, the early stirrings of the Islamic Empire, would mark the end of their way of life. They saw the desert as a place of spiritual purity, and they feared that the world beyond the desert would soon invade it, destroying the delicate balance they had created. In their fear and wisdom, the Nabateans made the fateful decision to vanish from the world. They chose to fade into obscurity, to leave behind no descendants, no legacy that could be claimed by the invaders of the future. The water systems, their greatest achievement, would remain, an enduring testament to their ingenuity, but with no one to claim them. The city of Petra would be abandoned, not out of necessity, but out of choice. It was a sacrifice, a self-imposed exile from the world. As the team pieced together the full scope of this revelation, they were struck by the profound nature of the Nabateans' decision. They had not been victims of their circumstances. They had not been driven by necessity or fate. They had chosen to disappear because they believed it was the only way to preserve what they had created. The city and its water systems were not just a marvel of engineering. They were a message that would outlast the civilization itself. The last clue in the inscriptions, however, was the most perplexing of all. It spoke of a secret hidden within the water systems, a secret that only the Nabateans themselves could understand. This hidden truth, buried deep within the mechanisms that sustained the city, was something beyond engineering, beyond architecture. It was a secret that had to do with the very essence of life in the desert, something that no one had yet uncovered. As Omar and his team stood on the precipice of this revelation, they realized that the mystery of the Nabateans had not yet been fully solved. The city of Petra still held its secrets, and perhaps, in the centuries to come, someone would uncover the final, terrifying truth hidden in the waters of the rose-red city. But for now, they knew this much. The Nabateans had not simply disappeared. They had left behind a riddle, carved into stone and water, that would challenge all who came after them to understand. Let's delve into the mysteries of the ancient Mycenaean Greeks around 1100 BC. The golden sun hovered high over the glittering Aegean Sea, casting long shadows across the bustling city of Mycenae. Towering stone walls, so massive and unyielding that even the gods would find them impossible to breach, encircled the palace. They were the work of generations, each stone placed with care and reverence, creating a fortress that could withstand any assault. Inside, the palace was a hive of activity, servants moving in haste, merchants hawking their wares, warriors returning from campaigns far and wide. The smell of freshly baked bread mixed with the briny scent of the sea breeze, and the laughter of feasting nobles echoed through the grand halls. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, sat at the head of the table, the weight of his crown heavy on his brow. His warriors, those who had returned from Troy, bloodied but victorious, gathered around him, their eyes glazed with the memories of war. The city was at the height of its power, the jewel of the Mycenaean world. Yet even in this moment of glory, a strange feeling of unease lingered in the air, like a dark cloud on the horizon. In the corner of the grand hall, a group of artisans worked tirelessly on intricate gold jewelry. The finest craftsmen in all of Greece, their creations were fit for kings and gods alike. But it wasn't just wealth that defined Mycenae. It was the ever-present sense of impending greatness. The Mycenaeans believed they were destined to rule the world, that their civilization would last for all eternity. Their palaces, their warriors, their art, each was a testament to the glory of their people. Yet even as they flourished, there were cracks forming in the foundation of their society. The once thriving trade routes that had connected Mycenae to distant lands were beginning to show signs of wear. Ships that once sailed across the Mediterranean, laden with goods and treasure, now returned empty, or not at all. The gold that had flowed so freely now seemed to trickle through their fingers. And within the palace walls, whispers of dissent spread like wildfire. The common people, who had long toiled in the shadow of their rulers, grew restless. They had seen the opulence of their kings, but their own lives were filled with hardship. As Agamemnon looked out over the lavish feast, his gaze was drawn to the great bronze shield that hung on the wall. It was a gift from the gods, forged by the finest blacksmiths in all of Greece, and it gleamed in the torchlight like a beacon of their power. Yet even as his eyes lingered on the shield, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. His warriors, his brothers in arms, had returned from Troy, but something had changed in them. They were not the same men who had set out to conquer the city. Their eyes were clouded with doubt, their hearts burdened by the horrors they had witnessed. And Agamemnon, despite his victories, felt the weight of that same burden. It was the same across all the Mycenaean cities. From Tiryns to Pylos, the Holoth, signs were becoming unmistakable. The palace economies that once supported thousands now seemed fragile, precarious. In the streets of Mycenae, once filled with laughter and song, there was an unsettling silence. The merchants no longer haggled with the same fervor. The warriors no longer paraded with the same pride. The gods, it seemed, had turned their gaze elsewhere. Yet the rulers of Mycenae remained confident. They had conquered Troy, defeated the might of the Trojans, and returned with treasures beyond imagination. The very walls of their cities were proof of their supremacy, the works of giants who had shaped them with their bare hands. The Mycenaeans believed their future was secure, that their empire would last forever. But Agamemnon could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had heard rumors of rebellion in the farthest corners of the kingdom. Discontent had been simmering for years, and now it seemed to be boiling over. But no one spoke of it openly. The warriors who returned from battle did not speak of their fear, nor did the common people voice their anger. In fact, they said nothing at all. The silence was the most unsettling thing of all. The palace grew darker as night fell, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows on the stone walls. The feasting continued, but the laughter was hollow, the food tasteless. Agamemnon could no longer ignore the strange feeling that had taken root in his chest, a feeling that, no matter how strong the walls of Mycenae were, they were not invincible. That something, somewhere, was slowly eroding the very foundations of their empire. And in the distance, beyond the city's walls, the wind whispered of a storm on the horizon. The wind had begun to shift. Once a familiar breeze that carried the scents of salt and flowers across the Aegean shores, it now brought an unsettling chill. In the heart of Mycenae, the once bustling city now felt eerily quiet. The streets deserted, the halls of the palace growing dimmer as the days passed. The grandeur that had defined the Mycenaeans seemed to fade with each setting sun. And in its place, a heavy unease lingered. The warriors who had returned from Troy no longer carried the same swagger that had once made them revered across the known world. They were hollow, like men who had seen too much, their eyes shadowed by memories too horrific to speak of. Some whispered of the horrors they had witnessed, the dark rituals, the bloodshed, the endless waves of death. But no one dared to voice the full truth. Those who had fought in Troy understood that the gods had turned their favor elsewhere. Victory, it seemed, had come with a price too steep to pay. Agamemnon's kingdom was crumbling from within, and he felt it more than anyone. His warriors, once the pride of Mycenae, had grown weary. The fierce warriors who had laid waste to the walls of Troy were now restless, filled with doubt. It was as if their very spirits had been drained. Rumors of rebellion began to seep through the cracks of the palace, though no one spoke of it aloud. The people who had once adored their kings now murmured in the shadows, their loyalty shaken by hunger and hardship. At the same time, something else was stirring along the coasts of Greece, a new and terrifying threat. The Sea Peoples, as they were called, had appeared out of nowhere, their ships emerging from the dark horizon like specters of doom. No one knew where they came from, but their presence was undeniable. Coastal cities fell, one after another, as if the Sea Peoples were nothing but a storm, ruthless and unrelenting. In the council chambers of Mycenae, Agamemnon's advisors were at odds. Some argued that the Sea Peoples were to blame for the downfall of the Mycenaeans. After all, they had attacked the cities along the coast, burning villages, and slaughtering all in their path. But others whispered that the disaster was not the work of invaders, but of something far more insidious, an internal rebellion. Perhaps the people, long oppressed by the royal family's greed and the heavy taxes that funded endless wars, had turned against their masters. Yet, no one spoke of the most disturbing possibility. The palaces, those monumental symbols of Mycenaean strength, were burning from within. No signs of invasion, no footprints in the ashes. The fires were not set by outsiders. They were the work of someone who knew the palace inside and out. This was no external enemy. This was something much more terrifying. The palace had become a house of ghosts, consumed by flames from within. As the days turned into weeks, the palace became a place of whispers and fear. Every chamber, every corridor was filled with tension. The warriors, once so certain of their power, now moved like shadows in the dark. Agamemnon could see it in their eyes. Something had broken inside them. It wasn't just the looming threat of the Sea Peoples, nor was it the growing unrest among the people. It was the silence that had settled over the kingdom, the silence of a people who no longer believed in their own destiny, the silence of those who had watched the flames consume everything they had built, and yet could not find the words to describe what had happened. Late one night, Agamemnon stood before the massive bronze shield that had once been a symbol of his strength. The shield was no longer gleaming in the light, its surface now dulled by time and neglect. In its reflection, Agamemnon saw not the proud king he had once been, but a man lost in a world he no longer understood. His mind raced with thoughts of the strange fires, of the mysterious sea peoples, of the possibility that his own people had turned against him. But above all, there was one question that gnawed at him. Why was there no word from the refugees? Why did no one speak of the fires, of the destruction? Why was there no answer to the burning question of who had destroyed their world? The silence was maddening. It was as if the Mycenaeans had been swallowed by the earth, their voices lost to time. No one had survived to tell the tale, and even the gods seemed to have turned their backs. The more Agamemnon thought about it, the more it became clear. Something had happened to the Mycenaean world that no one could explain, something so profound that it had erased the very memory of their civilization. And yet, the fire raged on. The palaces burned, their once mighty walls now crumbling under the weight of their own secrets. The great city of Mycenae, which had stood as a monument to the gods and men alike, was slowly being consumed by the flames. There was no salvation, no heroes to ride in and claim victory. The kingdom, like the once glorious city, was falling apart from the inside. The years that followed the fall of Mycenae became a blur. What had once been a bustling civilization, full of life and ambition, was now a shattered memory, its ruins slowly fading beneath the weight of time. The grand palaces, the towering walls, the storied treasure of kings, all that had been built in the name of glory and power, were reduced to little more than silent, crumbling monuments. The people scattered, fleeing into the hills and forests, abandoning the once great cities that had been their birthright. No one spoke of what had happened. The silence that had enveloped the land seemed to extend far beyond the physical world. Those who had survived the fires of Mycenae, those who had escaped the destruction, did not speak of the horrors they had witnessed. They spoke of other things, of new villages, of barren fields, of the struggle to survive, but never of the palace, never of the flames that had consumed everything they had known. Even the gods, once so close to the hearts of the Mycenaeans, were no longer a topic of conversation. The silence was suffocating, as if the very memory of the past had been erased from the minds of the people. The lands of Greece entered what would become known as the Dark Age. For nearly 4 centuries, the once thriving civilization lay dormant, its knowledge and culture lost to time. The written word disappeared along with the palaces. The art of writing, so advanced, so integral to the Mycenaean way of life, was forgotten. There were no scrolls to recount the great deeds of the heroes, no inscriptions to mark the kings and queens who had ruled with such pride. The stories of the Mycenaeans, the stories of Troy, of Agamemnon, and of the mighty warriors vanished into the void, as though the world had never known them. But there were whispers. Always there were whispers. In the forgotten villages that had sprung up in the wake of the Mycenaean collapse, the people spoke of strange things. They spoke of the fires that had consumed the palaces, of the eerie silence that followed, of the shadowy figures that had appeared along the coasts. Some said the sea peoples had come and gone, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. Others spoke of rebellion, of a people rising up against their rulers. But there was no consensus, no agreement on what had really happened. The questions remained unanswered, buried beneath the weight of the silence. Yet the silence was not the only thing that gnawed at the edges of memory. There was something more, something deeper, something unsettling. The ruins of the palaces, scattered across the land, were a constant reminder of what had once been. Their immense stone walls, so colossal that even the gods would have found them impossible to construct, still stood in defiance of time. The Cyclopean walls, so massive that they seemed to have been built by giants, seemed to mock the very idea of their builders' downfall. How could such a mighty people, so advanced in their engineering, so skilled in warfare, have fallen so completely? The answer, it seemed, was elusive. There was no clear explanation for what had happened to the Mycenaeans. No one knew who had caused the destruction, or why it had been so complete. Had it been the Sea Peoples? Had it been an internal rebellion, a civil war that tore the kingdom apart? Perhaps it had been both, or perhaps something darker still had taken place, something that the survivors were too afraid to speak of, something that had erased the very memory of the Mycenaean civilization. But perhaps, in the end, it didn't matter. What was clear was that the Mycenaean world had been consumed by its own silence. It had been a civilization too full of its own greatness to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. It had been a society so obsessed with its own power that it had failed to notice the slow unraveling of its foundation. And when the end came, it came not with a bang, but with a quiet whisper, a final breath that left no trace. And so the Mycenaean civilization faded into the shadows of history, a lost world whose story would never be fully told. The ruins stood, silent sentinels to a forgotten past, their secrets locked away forever. There would be no grand reckoning, no final victory over the forces that had brought them low. The people, the kings, the heroes, they were all gone, lost to time. In the years that followed, the world moved on. New civilizations rose, their own stories unfolding in the light of the sun. But the tale of the Mycenaeans remained shrouded in darkness. The fire had consumed them, but the silence had consumed everything else. What had happened to them? Who had brought about their fall? And why they had vanished? Those questions would never be answered. The silence, it seemed, was all that remained. The fire had taken their bodies. The silence had taken their souls. Step into the ancient world as we uncover the secrets of the Olmec civilization. Around 400 BC, in the dense, mist-shrouded jungles of Mesoamerica, where the sounds of unseen creatures echoed through the trees, the Olmec people were rising. Their civilization was destined to be the mother culture of the region, an unseen force that would shape the future of Mesoamerica for centuries to come. The year was 400 BCE, and the settlement of San Lorenzo was alive with energy. Massive stone platforms stood tall amidst the verdant expanse, their shapes as mysterious as the people who built them. The Olmec had found their calling, carving their mark into the very land. Ixkik, a young sculptor, watched from the edge of the construction site, his eyes tracing the motion of the workers as they labored with remarkable precision. He was not just a craftsman. He was one of the chosen few entrusted with a task that would shape history itself, the creation of the colossal stone heads that would come to define the Olmec civilization. He had already sculpted smaller versions of the heads, but the time had come to carve the giants, monolithic figures that would stand taller than any man, their faces carved with striking African-like features. They were symbols of power, but to Ixkik, they were more than that. He felt a strange, inexplicable pull towards them, as though they were calling to him. Ixkik's hands trembled as he worked. Each stroke of his chisel brought the stone to life, and he marveled at the way the features seemed to emerge from the rock itself. But with every completed head, his sense of unease grew. There was something about their blank, unblinking gaze that unsettled him, as though they were watching him, waiting. Ixkik didn't understand it. But he knew that the Olmec were building something beyond their comprehension. These stone heads were not mere monuments. They were a message, a testament to a deeper purpose that the people of San Lorenzo could not yet fully grasp. The ceremony to place the first of the massive heads was approaching. The entire city was preparing for the momentous event. The priests chanted ancient hymns, their voices rising in harmony with the rhythms of the jungle, while the people gathered in awe. The air was thick with anticipation. Ixkik stood near the center of the gathering, his heart pounding in his chest. He had helped carve the stone heads, but the task that awaited him now felt even greater. It was his responsibility to oversee the placement of the first head, the one that would stand at the heart of San Lorenzo. As the great stone was slowly moved into place, Ixkik could not shake the feeling that the head was more than just an artifact. The massive figure loomed before him, its face sculpted with features that seemed to defy the land itself. There were rumors among the people, whispers of how the stone heads had been carved with features that did not belong to their own ancestors. Some said they resembled the faces of people who had come from across the seas, distant lands that no one in Mesoamerica had ever seen. Ixkik had heard the stories of travelers from faraway lands, of mysterious visitors with skin as dark as the earth itself. But these were just stories, weren't they? As the head was positioned and the priests began their rituals, Ixkik found himself staring at the massive stone figure. Its eyes, though made of stone, seemed to follow him. A shiver ran down his spine. The sensation was impossible to ignore. It was as though the stone head was alive, its watchful gaze fixed on him, waiting for something. Ixkik turned away, unwilling to meet the gaze any longer. He focused on the ceremony, the sounds of the chanting priests growing louder in his ears. Yet something gnawed at the back of his mind. Later that night, after the people had returned to their homes and the city had quieted, Ixkik stood alone in the ceremonial site. The giant head loomed before him, its features bathed in the light of the full moon. The air was heavy with a strange energy, and Ixkik could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He approached the head slowly, his steps hesitant. As he drew closer, he noticed something he had not seen before. Lines carved into the stone that appeared to lead towards the base. They were faint, barely noticeable, but they were there. It was as if the stone itself held a secret, a hidden message that no one had yet uncovered. Ixkik knelt beside the head, his fingers brushing against the stone. The markings seemed to pulse under his touch, as though they were alive. He felt a surge of energy course through him, a connection to something ancient, something powerful. It was at that moment that he realized the truth. The heads were not just symbols of power. They were guardians, watchers placed here to oversee something far more significant than anyone could comprehend. As the moonlight danced across the surface of the stone, Ixkik felt a deep unease settle in his chest. The Olmec had carved these heads to mark the rise of their civilization. But there was more to the story than anyone had yet realized. The heads were facing outward, aligned with the movements of the heavens, as though they were waiting for something to come. But what? The answer, Ixkik feared, might be something the Olmec were not ready to face. Over the course of the next few centuries, the Olmec flourished. Their civilization became a beacon of power and influence in Mesoamerica. The colossal stone heads, now scattered across their ceremonial centers, stood as silent witnesses to their glory. Each face was meticulously carved, their features both intimidating and awe-inspiring, watching over the people and the land they had shaped. The Olmec had given Mesoamerica a legacy of knowledge, writing, the calendar, and the ball game, all of which spread to the Maya and other cultures that would follow. But beneath their triumphs lay a growing sense of unease. Ixchik's descendants, the rulers and sculptors of the next generations, inherited the mantle of their forebears, but the weight of it seemed heavier with each passing year. The land, once teeming with life, was now strained by the forces of nature. Droughts began to stretch longer, and rivers that once flowed abundantly began to dry. The ancient cities of the Olmec, including San Lorenzo, began to show signs of wear. The stone heads, though majestic, appeared to suffer from the elements, their features eroding and cracking under the pressure of time. The rulers, desperate to maintain the grandeur of the Olmec, began to perform more elaborate ceremonies in an attempt to appease the gods and restore balance to the land. But these rituals, once powerful and revered, no longer seemed to hold the same sway. The ceremonies grew darker, more secretive. The stone heads, those silent sentinels, seemed to grow even more distant, their gazes more solemn, as if they were waiting for something. A strange and unsettling thought began to take root among the Olmec elite. Perhaps the stone heads weren't just symbols of power. They were markers, warning signs of an approaching calamity. By the time the year 700 BCE arrived, the Olmec were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. The cities that had once thrived now lay in ruins. San Lorenzo, the birthplace of their civilization, was abandoned, its streets empty, its once gleaming stone platforms now overgrown with creeping vines. The great heads stood unmoving, their faces still fixed on the horizon. There was no sign of the people who had built them. The Olmec had disappeared. But where had they gone? Why had they vanished without a trace? As the years passed, the mystery deepened. The Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures that followed the Olmec took their knowledge, their inventions, and their stories, but the Olmec themselves were nothing more than a memory. Yet the stone heads remained, silently guarding the ruins, their significance only deepening as time wore on. To the outside world, the disappearance of the Olmec was a riddle with no solution. Dr. Ayana Reyes, an archaeologist from the University of Mexico, found herself drawn to the enigma of the Olmec. She had spent years studying their culture, fascinated by the grandeur of their civilization and the eerie silence that surrounded their disappearance. Armed with a wealth of ancient texts and the most cutting-edge tools available, she set out to uncover the truth behind the Olmec's fall. Her team of archaeologists arrived in the heart of the Olmec territory, determined to unlock the secrets that had been buried for over 1,000 years. The landscape was as beautiful as it was haunting. Towering trees rose from the jungle floor, casting long shadows over the abandoned ruins. The once great ceremonial sites, though worn by time, still held an otherworldly power. Dr. Reyes stood before one of the great heads, her hand brushing the rough stone. The face before her, though weathered and eroded, still carried the imprint of something ancient and deeply powerful. "There's more here than we can see," she whispered to herself. Much more. Her team had uncovered several more ceremonial sites, each one more enigmatic than the last. In one location, they discovered a network of underground chambers, some of which were filled with carefully arranged offerings, ornate pottery, finely crafted jade, and even skeletal remains. The remains were those of people who had clearly been buried with great care, their bodies placed in ritualistic positions. It was clear that the Olmec had not simply abandoned their cities. They had intentionally sealed away something. Perhaps it was their greatest secret. Perhaps they had sealed it away to protect themselves from something they could not control. But what had happened to the Olmec? Where had they gone? And why had they abandoned their cities so suddenly, so completely? Dr. Reyes's team began to piece together the evidence, and the answers only deepened the mystery. The burial sites they uncovered showed signs of ritual sacrifice, but the scale and precision of the ceremonies were unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was as if the Olmec had known something was coming, something they could not stop, and so they had sealed their fate and their civilization away. The stone heads, though silent, seemed to hold the key to the mystery. The way they were placed in such precise alignment with the stars, the way they faced the horizon, it all pointed to something beyond mere symbolism. Dr. Reyes's pulse quickened as she realized the heads were not just guardians. They were watchers, waiting for something to return. Something was coming, and the Olmec had known it. But had they sealed it away? Or had they too become victims of a force beyond their understanding? Dr. Ayanna Reyes stood before the final ruin, the heart of the Olmec's mystery, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on her. The last ceremonial site they had uncovered was unlike anything they had found before. The ground was still, unnaturally so, as if it had been waiting for them, or for something else to return. The massive stone heads, all facing the same direction, stood like silent sentinels, guarding what lay beneath. Their unblinking eyes, eroded by time, seemed to watch her, watch all of them, with an intensity that unsettled her. The excavation site was buried deep beneath the earth, a hidden chamber far from the reach of the usual Mesoamerican rituals. It had taken days to clear away the tangled vines and roots that had grown over the area, but now, as the last of the debris was cleared, they could finally see what lay beneath. A vast subterranean structure, as if carved from the very bones of the earth. In the center of the chamber, a large stone altar lay, surrounded by faded murals depicting scenes of strange, unknown rituals. As Ayanna's team set to work, the oppressive silence of the place pressed in on them. The walls were covered in symbols that she recognized from the Olmec's most sacred texts, but some were different. They were newer, darker, more disturbing. Some depicted the stone heads, but others showed something much more terrifying. Great shadowy figures, far darker than any human or deity. Ayanna's hand shook as she traced one of the symbols, an image of a large, dark eye, its iris swirling with what seemed like an otherworldly energy. It was the same symbol she had found in the ancient texts, but it had never been so clear, so alive. The unease that had been building within her grew into something more palpable now. The further they dug, the more she felt as though something was watching them. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with each passing minute. It was as if the very earth itself had become aware of their intrusion. The tension in the air snapped when one of Ayanna's team members, Luis, a seasoned archaeologist, called out to her from across the chamber. "Dr. Reyes, you need to see this." Ayanna's heart skipped a beat as she hurried over to where Luis stood. He was kneeling before a set of stone carvings, his flashlight illuminating a pattern that sent a chill down her spine. The carvings depicted a scene she had never seen before in any Olmec text. The figures in the carvings were humanoid, but they were wrong. Their faces were featureless, their bodies elongated, their limbs unnaturally thin. Surrounding them were the same stone heads, but they were positioned differently now, facing the figures in the carvings, their eyes wide and unblinking. "It's them," Ayanna whispered. "The beings in the carvings. These are the ones the Olmec sealed away. But why? What were they?" Luis stood up, his face pale. I don't know, but I think we've found what the Olmec were protecting us from. As the team continued to uncover the details of the carvings, the symbols became clearer. There was a pattern, a rhythm to them, as if they were warning signs. The figures in the carvings weren't just passive observers. They were beings of immense power, creatures that had once been sealed beneath the earth by the Olmec. Ayanna could feel it now. This was no ordinary ritual site. The Olmec had not only sealed these beings away, but they had built the stone heads as a warning, a safeguard to keep them from returning. The heads, Ayanna murmured. They were watching, waiting for something to come, for these beings to return. But why had the Olmec gone to such lengths to protect the world from whatever was buried here? And what had happened to them? Had they failed in their task? Before Ayanna could voice another thought, the ground beneath them trembled. A low, ominous rumble echoed through the chamber, reverberating in the walls. The team froze, their eyes wide with fear. The tremors grew stronger, and the air grew colder. Then, with a deafening crack, the stone altar in the center of the chamber split open, revealing a dark, swirling void beneath it. The air around them grew heavy with an unnatural force, pulling at their very souls. Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the thing the Olmec had sealed away, the threat they had tried so desperately to contain. The darkness that had lain dormant for centuries was waking up. The stone heads, positioned in perfect alignment with the stars, seemed to vibrate, their gazes fixed on the open void. The eyes, once silent and lifeless, now seemed to shine with an eerie light. It was as if they were watching, waiting for the exact moment when the seals would break and the ancient force would return. The ground shook violently, and the dark eye symbol from the carvings seemed to come alive, swirling with energy. The figures in the murals shifted, as if they were emerging from the stone itself, moving toward the void. Ayanna felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The Olmec had tried to warn them. The heads had been guardians, but now their purpose was becoming clear. The chamber filled with an oppressive darkness as the void beneath the altar grew larger. A voice, low and incomprehensible, echoed through the chamber, growing louder with each passing second. The beings, those shadowy figures, were returning, and the world, once again, would be at their mercy. Ayanna could hear the sounds of the earth cracking, as if the very fabric of reality was breaking apart. Her team scattered in panic, but Ayanna remained rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the swirling darkness. The stone heads, now illuminated by an otherworldly glow, seemed to be watching not just her, but the entire world. The Olmec had sealed something away. They had watched. They had waited. And now, the time had come. The world was on the brink. 10 civilizations, millions of people, all gone without satisfactory explanation. Some left carvings, some left ruins, none left answers. And the most terrifying part? It could happen again. In fact, dozens of civilizations throughout history simply ended. What did they know that we don't? What did they see that made them abandon everything? Perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved.